This story began in the year 666 of our era. The great commander Yon Gaesumun, who was called the god protector of Goguryeo, passed away. His death led to a great split throughout Goguryeo, and the state could no longer hold back the 100,000-strong army of the Tang dynasty. 2 years have passed since then, and now the last forces of Goguryeo found themselves driven into the Pyongyang fortress. The Tang army surrounded it, and for several days continued to publicly execute peasants to break the will of those hiding behind the fortress walls. But for the Tang warriors themselves, it was merely amusement. And so, to the scaffold they dragged another unfortunate peasant who kept begging for mercy, as if driven mad by fear. But his executioner only said with a cruel grin that he was born in the wrong country. However, just as the executioner was about to bring down the sword on his victim's neck, he was struck at that very moment by an enemy arrow. Everyone immediately turned toward the direction from which it flew, and saw a horseman on the hill. And in the next moment, a mounted squad rushed from that hill toward the Tang army. All its warriors and even the horses were clad in black armor, and the standard-bearers carried a scarlet banner with a three-legged crow. At the sight of this war emblem, the Tang were horrified because their opponent was the ghost cavalry of Goguryeo. But then the captain angrily shouted at his soldiers and ordered them all to stop panicking. The fear of the enemy immediately changed to fear of their own captain. And then he declared that it was madness to think that the miserable 3,000 warriors of Goguryeo could withstand the 100,000-strong Tang army. And then the captain was the first to rush into attack and shouted on the run that the insignificant remnants of Goguryeo were no match for them. The commander of the ghost cavalry, whose name was Ko Chuncheon, rushed to meet him. But he was not just a commander, but the half-brother of the emperor himself and the great shaman of the entire Goguryeo army. Therefore, in the next moment, Chuncheon struck down the enemy captain with a single blow. At such a sight, the Tang warriors were horrified again. This became their fatal mistake, because Chuncheon did not stop and, bursting into the enemy ranks, beheaded 2 soldiers. And in the next moment, the entire ghost cavalry of Goguryeo joined the commander, and a fierce battle broke out between the 2 squads. However, despite the numerical advantage, the enemy began to quickly push back the Tang warriors. Meanwhile, part of the Goguryeo warriors freed the captured peasants, and soon Chuncheon pierced the last enemy with his spear. The phantom cavalry won this battle, but not the war. New Tang forces were already approaching from the rear. Then Chuncheon summoned the shaman of the phantom cavalry named Yon Huigoram and ordered him to escort the civilians to the Pyongyang fortress. Then the commander addressed his deputy, Buru, and his twin brother Uru, and ordered them to delay the pursuit. And Chuncheon himself would go at the vanguard to clear the way for the refugees. Armed with a second spear, the commander of the phantom cavalry fearlessly burst into the ranks of the enemy. The peasants rushed after with all their might, while Chuncheon, like a living storm, raced through the crowd of Tang warriors. Soon he managed to lead all the civilians through, while Buru distracted the enemy's attention. But suddenly one of the rescued peasants approached Chuncheon and respectfully asked the commander to allow him to fight. However, before Chuncheon could say a word, the son of that peasant interrupted the conversation. The boy looked fearlessly into the commander's eyes and declared that he would fight instead of his father. Chuncheon liked the brave youth, but in response he asked, "Does he know how to stay in the saddle?" The boy was confused by the question, and his face already revealed everything. Then Chuncheon told the youth that he could not fight and ordered to bring a horse for his father. The boy wanted to object, but his father put his hand on his shoulder and smiled, asking him to protect their mother and sister. And when the man mounted the horse, Chuncheon ordered the other peasants to run to the Pyongyang fortress. The peasants did as they were told, and meanwhile, from the opposite side, a huge Tang army was advancing on the phantom cavalry of Goguryeo. But Chuncheon calmly raised his spear and ordered his loyal warriors, "Do not let a single enemy escape." Soon the peasants reached the fortress gates and began desperately begging to be let in. They shouted and pleaded so loudly that their cries reached the ears of the last ruler of Goguryeo, Emperor Bojang. Clenching the armrest of the throne and grinding his teeth in despair, he turned to the captain of the guard and asked, "Is there really no way out?" In response, Daimodak knelt before him on one knee and reported that there were too many enemies. At these words, Bojang began to have a hysterical fit. First he laughed nervously, then bitterly cried. However, the captain of the guard calmly stated that His Majesty must flee the fortress before it was captured. But in response, the emperor said that he could not protect the state founded by King Tonmyeonsin, and even if he fled, where would he go? Then Daimodak revealed that he had prepared a ship on which His Majesty was to sail south, in order to then gather troops and launch a counterattack. But Bojang wearily leaned back on the throne's backrest and just as wearily asked, "Who will lead these troops?" Then in response, Daimodak loudly declared that it would be the great Sajako Chuncheon. At this name, the emperor seemed to come to his senses and a spark of hope lit in his eyes. And then he looked at the captain of the guard and asked, "Will he fulfill his last request?" Meanwhile, the ghostly cavalry of Goguryeo managed to deal with the first wave of enemies. But this victory was not without casualties. Chunshin glanced over the bodies of fallen comrades, and among them noticed the peasant who decided to fight alongside them. The commander held his gaze on him and said that the son would remember his valiant death. However, there was no time to mourn the fallen, for a new wave of Tang warriors was approaching. Brothers Buru and Uru argued among themselves who would kill more enemies, and the shaman Huigaram told his commander that the outcome of the battle was already decided. Chunshin knew this, and yet informed his warriors that they would not break through further. Then Buru suggested competing to see who would send more enemies to the afterlife, and the loser would go pull the beard of the greatest Yama himself. Such a proposal amused Chunshin, and he gladly agreed to it. And in the next moment, the commander laughed loudly, and the entire ghostly cavalry laughed with him. But as soon as the laughter subsided, Chunshin's face immediately changed, and he declared that not a single Tang creature would set foot in the Pyongyang fortress. However, in the next moment, its gates suddenly opened, and a rider came out. It was a messenger of the emperor himself who announced his order to retreat to the port and wait there for further instructions. Such an order struck Chunshin, but he had no right to disobey it. Therefore, the ghostly cavalry of Goguryeo left the Pyongyang fortress and headed to the port, as was commanded. However, the strange order of the emperor continued to trouble the warriors. Then Huigaram suggested that the emperor intended to sail south and regroup there. But suddenly a courier caught up with the column of riders and reported that about 500 Tang warriors were pursuing a cart that had left the fortress. Huigaram had decided that one of the nobles was fleeing, but the messenger declared that the emperor's flag was flying over the carriage. Meanwhile, the situation for the fugitives was very dire. The enemies were quickly catching up to them. Captain Daimodok ordered the guard to stay close to the carriage and not let a single arrow pass. But suddenly the vice-captain turned his horse and ordered the others to keep moving forward while he bought them time. Daimodok wanted to stop him, but the vice-captain refused to listen and ordered 10 horsemen to follow him. It was pure suicide, but the vice-captain shouted to his comrades with a smile that they must protect His Highness the Air Prince. Unfortunately, the enemy commander struck first and struck down the vice-captain with a spear. Soon the Tansky warriors dealt with the 10 horsemen and resumed the chase. However, the vice-captain's sacrifice was not in vain, because in the next moment an arrow struck down the enemy commander. And when Daimodok turned around, he saw ghost cavalry horsemen approaching in the distance. At the sight of them, the captain of the guard could barely hold back tears. Soon the horsemen circled around the emperor's carriage and rushed to meet the pursuers. And after the captain's greeting, Chuncheon ordered his warriors to destroy all enemies and not let a single one escape. And then 2 squads clashed in a fierce battle, but the Tang warriors had no chance. Uru was an archer of the ghost cavalry and was famous not only for his accuracy, but also for the ability to kill 2 enemies with 1 arrow. But his twin brother Buru was famous for his extraordinary strength. With 1 swing of his axe, he could cut a man in half. But while the Goguryeo warriors were finishing off the enemy, Chuncheon asked Daimodok, "Is His Majesty in the carriage?" However, in response, the captain of the guard lowered his gaze with a sense of guilt and confessed that His Highness the Crown Prince was in the carriage. And then he voiced the emperor's last order, to put the young heir on a ship and deliver him to a safe place. Thus, the ghost cavalry of Goguryeo took upon themselves the execution of their lord's last will. And at dawn the next day, a port appeared in the distance. However, the next moment, scouts ran up to Chuncheon and reported that the enemy had tracked them. Without hesitation, the commander ordered the horsemen to follow him and told the other warriors to protect the heir. The horsemen of the ghost cavalry formed a wall, and then Chuncheon ordered to open fire immediately. And in the next moment, a rain of arrows fell upon the enemy squad. However, this was only a small part of the Tang army. The main forces were observing the battle from a safe distance from the arrows, and they were led by the supreme commander of the Tang Empire himself, Wei Chunhyun. Meanwhile, the carriage with the Crown Prince continued its journey to the port. But approaching the shore, scouts warned that Tang troops were already on the coast. They encountered a small detachment left by Captain Daimodok to protect the ship. They were commanded by a swordsman named Mount Querion, who gave the order to stand to the death until the Crown Prince was on the ship. And when the Tang warriors launched a frontal attack, he was the first to rush to meet them. Meanwhile, the supreme commander of the Tang Empire decided to meet the commander of the Phantom Cavalry face to face. Chunhyun offered Chuncheon a deal. If the Phantom Cavalry surrendered, he would personally ask His Imperial Majesty to grant them the honor of fighting for the Tang Empire. In response, Chuncheon said nothing, only nodded, causing the supreme commander to laugh loudly and say that it was a wise choice. However, when Chunhyun offered Chuncheon the roll of his right hand, at that very second an arrow pierced his eyes. She let Uru in, who irritably asked his brother, could it be that the Tang soldiers only fight with words? Meanwhile, those very Tang soldiers were shocked by the death of their commander-in-chief. Chuncheon gave an order to Huigaram, and in the next moment a hail of battle axes rushed towards the enemies. By noon, the battle on the coast ended with the victory of the Goguryeo warriors, and soon Querion noticed the approach of the great Saja with the Phantom Cavalry. Only the Tang army was still pursuing them, so Chunchan immediately ordered to set sail. And so the phantom cavalry left their native shores and headed south. Having made sure that the enemy no longer pursued them, Chunchan decided to personally check the condition of the crown prince. He also wanted to find out what name was given to the young emperor and where his majesty was. To the first question, Demudok told that his majesty named the prince Ilchi, but to the second question the captain lacked the courage to answer. Instead, he handed Chunchan a letter and explained that it was from his majesty. Chunchan handed the infant to a maid and took the letter, in which the last order of the emperor to his younger brother was written. The last wish of Emperor Bojan was that Chunchan take the child and sail away with him towards a peaceful life. However, after reading the letter, Chunchan crumpled it in his hands with anger, for he had no right to call the emperor brother, and now he calls him brother. Then the commander of the Phantom Cavalry asked Daimudok about the fate of the Pyongyang fortress. But in response, the captain of the guard suddenly fell to his knees before him and began to beg for death. Such behavior shocked Chunchan, because it could mean only one thing. The Pyongyang fortress had fallen. And to confirm this, Chunchan saw thick smoke rising in the distance. The fortress was burning along with all the inhabitants, whom the commander of the Phantom Cavalry, to his sorrow, could not protect. However, Chunchan had no time to mourn the dead, for a terrible storm suddenly attacked the Goguryeo fleet. The waves were so fierce and huge that they sank one of the ships. Then the captain of the ship, scared half to death, rushed to the bridge and shouted that the ship needed to be turned around. He had spent his whole life at sea, but had never seen such terrible waves before. And suddenly, right in front of the fleet, a huge wall of water rose, terrifying the ship's crew. However, despite this, the crown prince in Chunchan's hands was happy and laughed loudly. The commander of the Phantom Cavalry took it as a sign from above and told his warriors that they had no way back. And then Chunchan drew his sword and ordered to break through the waves, for it was the will of Crown Prince Ilchi, and the last battle of the Goguryeo fleet. No one on the ship dared to disobey the order, and in the next moment the ships crashed straight into the water wall. And then the world was engulfed in a dazzling light and everything fell silent. Chunchan came to consciousness on the ship's deck, holding tightly the faithful sword and the infant. Fortunately, the crown prince was unharmed and even in a joyful mood. But the ship's captain was in complete shock and bewilderment at what he saw before his eyes. Right in front of the fleet was land with a dense forest, but the nearest mainland was still very far away. But Buru saw no problem in this, so he carelessly ordered to dock at the shore. But in response, the captain advised him to look around, and then Buru realized that they were not at sea, but in the middle of a lake surrounded by land. From this discovery, Buru almost strangled the captain, deciding that he had been leading them in circles on the lake for several days. But Huigaram asked his friend to calm down, and explained that the captain was clearly not to blame for what was happening. Then the shaman addressed Chuncheon and asked, what should they do next? In response, the great Saja declared that they were now far from their homeland in any case, which means the fleet is safe here. Then Huigaram ordered the captain to begin the landing, and he was only glad to leave the ship as soon as possible. Soon the warriors of Goguryeo landed on the shore and quickly built a camp. And the first order of Chuncheon on the new land was to scout the surroundings, which the commander entrusted to the brothers Buru and Uru. And Huigaram was entrusted by the great Saja to arrange guards around the perimeter of the camp. Then Chuncheon addressed the captain of the guard Daimudoku and ordered him to report the number of survivors. Well, after the report, everyone engaged in performing their direct duties. Everyone except Chuncheon, who remained standing at the entrance to the tent. It was then that he heard the crown prince suddenly roar. Chuncheon immediately entered the tent and saw how the maidservants were trying in every way to calm the infant. But noticing the great Saja, all three maidens instantly bowed and addressed him as his highness. However, Chuncheon demanded that they no longer call him that. Then one of the maids apologized and explained that it was time to change the heir prince's diaper, so they needed to be alone. But the commander of the Phantom Cavalry was not going anywhere, and made the maids understand that he would not take his eyes off the baby. They had no choice but to change the prince's diapers under the watchful eye of the great Saja. But when the maid removed the diapers from the baby, Chuncheon immediately ordered to call the captain of the guard at once. Meanwhile, Buru and Uru with a small detachment were combing the forest in search of game. But the reconnaissance brought no results, which made the frustrated and hungry Buru say that they would be very lucky if they found at least one boar here. However, Uru disagreed with his brother, because in this forest you would not find even an ant, let alone a boar. But suddenly, very close by, there was the crackling of breaking branches and the rustling of leaves. The brothers immediately grabbed their weapons and ordered the other warriors to be on alert. And the noise kept increasing, which made Buru happily think that tonight they would definitely have the meat of a huge wild boar for dinner. But how surprised the Goguryeo warriors were when from behind the bushes appeared anyone but clearly not a beast and not even a human. 4 mysterious creatures approached the detachment, who looked like people but had pig snouts instead of faces. Uru ordered everyone not to take their eyes off the aliens and suggested that in these lands, boars walk on 2 legs. But then Buru asked his brother, if these are really boars, why do they have green skin? For Uru, the question was very stupid, so he irritably explained the obvious to his brother. These boars are simply sick. And then a heated argument broke out between the brothers, which only increased their appetite. Therefore, Buru and Uru agreed that it does not matter whether these boars walk on 2 legs or have green skin. The main thing is that they taste like wild boar meat. And in the next moment, the brothers eagerly and with anticipation pounced on their strange prey. Meanwhile, Captain Daimodok rushed to the tent of the great Saja. But there he was met with a shocking sight. The commander of the Phantom Cavalry held a sword to the throat of an unfortunate maid. Noticing the captain's arrival, Chun-Chon told him that the child was switched, but none of the maids could explain it. Then Daimodok knelt again and presented another letter from His Majesty. Chun-Chon accepted the letter, and then the captain of the guard explained that the emperor ordered it to be delivered when the Goguryeo fleet was safe. The letter stated that Yilchi is not the crown prince, but the daughter of Captain Yol Ryuhwan, who remained to defend the Pyongyang fortress and His Majesty. Emperor Bojin thought that the life of this girl would be too short, so he sent her to Chun-Chon. For this deception, the emperor asked for forgiveness. But there was no other way. Otherwise, Chun-Chon, without hesitation, would have sacrificed himself for the country. Although imperial blood flowed in him, Bojang did not want to condemn his younger brother to even greater suffering, since he had already spent his whole life on the battlefield. At farewell, the emperor asked Chun-Chon not to blame himself for not being able to protect the country, but to live differently, listening to his heart. And Bojang also very much hoped that when the girl grew up, she would become a faithful companion to his younger brother. With this, the emperor's farewell letter ended, and Chun-Chon quietly said that His Majesty had granted him freedom. And the emperor also gave him hope, which now joyfully reached out to him in tiny hands. Chun-Chon turned away to hide his embarrassment from everyone, and ordered the maid to change the child's diapers. Then he approached Daimodok and asked about the infant's mother, to which the captain of the guard said that she stayed to defend the fortress together with her husband. After that, Chun-Chon silently left the tent and looking at the clear sky wondered, what should he do now? For the first time, he took a sword in his hands at 6 years old, and at 16 he was already on the battlefield. When enemies invaded the homeland, Chun-Chon fought on the front line. His duty, as an illegitimate offspring of imperial blood, was to protect the Goguryeo Empire. But now everything had lost meaning, and Chun-Chon no longer knew. For what purpose should he unsheath his sword? When it got dark and Buru and Uru returned from reconnaissance, Chun-Chon convened a meeting. The brothers reported that they had scouted the forests but found no enemies. Also, the local forest did not resemble the forests of the Goguryeo Empire, and some trees looked different. But the strangest discovery was the green boars that walked on 2 legs like humans. However, before Buru could finish his report, a worried sentry suddenly burst into the tent. Daimodok immediately reprimanded the guard for making noise during the council, and asked about the cause of the commotion. But in response, the sentry, stammering with fear, said that it seemed the heavens were angry. Everyone went outside the tent, and then the sentry pointed to the night sky. There, the Goguryeo warriors saw 3 celestial discs, as if the moon had given birth to 2 daughters. But besides that, Huigarum noticed that the stars in the sky were completely different, as if it were a completely different world. However, in response to this discovery, Chun-Chon concluded that at least for now, they could all stop worrying about the Tang army. The next day, Buru and Uru decided to cook the meat of a strange wild boar they had managed to catch. Only the brothers did not suspect that the creature they were about to slaughter like a pig was actually an orc. The snouted native tried to explain to his tormentors that he was not an animal, but the brothers did not understand his speech. Buru thought the boar was trying to say something, but Uru asked his brother, where had he ever seen talking boars? However, the next moment the brothers were stopped by the arriving Chun-Chon with Huigaram, and when Buru asked for the reason, the commander explained that since the boar was green, it might be sick. But then one of the sentries rushed to the group, shouting about a big problem while running. Buru asked irritably, what now? Could it be that a 2-legged bull had appeared? However, the answer surprised everyone present, because the sentry asked in astonishment, how did he know that? And the next moment, that very 2-legged bull rammed one of the erected walls. This creature was called a minotaur, but for the ghostly Goguryeo cavalry, it was just another enemy. The warriors met it with a wall of shields, but the minotaur smashed its axe onto it and sent 2 soldiers flying. Then the warriors responded with a volley of battle axes. However, despite multiple wounds, the minotaur stood firm on its feet. But not for long, because in the next moment boarding hooks clamped onto its horns. It was the brothers Buru and Uru who lassoed the minotaur, and with all their extraordinary strength pulled it back. And when the minotaur fell to its knees, Uru ordered his archers to pepper it with arrows. And finally Buru finished off the beast by beheading it with a single blow. With a satisfied look, slinging the axe over his shoulder, Buru asked his brother, can we then eat this bull? In response, Uru declared that now the great Saja certainly would not forbid it. However, in the next moment, the brothers discovered that the Minotaur was not alone. 3 more of its kind ran out of the forest. And even more, following the Minotaurs ran 4 kobolds. However, the brothers did not lose their composure and immediately rushed to meet the new opponents. The first Minotaur brought down an axe on Buru, but he simply blocked the blow. Then the second Minotaur came in from the side, intending to cut Buru in half. But in the next moment, Chunchon entered the fight, cutting off the Minotaur's paw. Meanwhile, Buru dealt with his opponent, splitting him from nose to tail. And Uru finished off the second Minotaur with a precise shot to the forehead. But when the dust settled, Chunchon noticed that he felt much lighter than before. Then Huigaram explained to the commander that in this world the gravity is weak, so armor, weapons, and the body feel lighter than usual. However, the instructive lecture was interrupted by a wounded Minotaur who intended to take revenge on Chunchon. This became his fatal mistake. In the blink of an eye, the commander of the Phantom Cavalry cut the Minotaur into pieces. And sheathing his sword, Chunchon admitted with regret that the Tang warriors were no match for him now. But if he had such strength in his homeland, the Goguryeo Empire would not have fallen. Meanwhile, the spearmen finished off 2 kobolds, and the remaining 3 fled. Chunchon ordered Buru to catch and destroy the fugitives, and also to scout as much territory as possible. And at that time, a blonde man was rushing through the forest, leading a girl behind him. The man was a resident of this world, and his name was Veron, and the girl was his niece named Sarah. Veron ordered her to run further while he delayed their pursuer, who was a huge ogre. Veron shot at him with a bow, but the arrow bounced off the thick hide like off a stone. And in the next moment, Sarah suddenly tripped over a stone and fell to the ground. The ogre immediately aimed at the helpless girl, ignoring Veron's desperate shots. However, when the monster had already stretched out its paw towards its victim, someone swiftly grabbed the girl and took her away from danger. And when Sarah opened her eyes, she saw before her a stocky and very attractive man with a beard, which made her mistake him for a dwarf. Only Buru had no idea what a dwarf was, nor did he understand what language the girl was speaking at all. But there was no time for introductions. The ogre was already looming over Buru and raised his arm for a crushing attack. And in the next moment, the ogre slammed his fists with such monstrous force that the ground cracked. But by that time, Buru and Sarah were no longer in the same place. The deputy commander instantly moved to a safe distance and set the girl down on the ground. And then Buru fearlessly rushed towards the ogre. Stunned Veron ran up to his niece, still not believing what was happening. Because how could an ordinary person stand alone against such a monster? However, in the next moment, Buru split the ogre in half with one blow. After such a spectacle, Veron and Sarah immediately fell to their knees and began to thank Mother Earth for sending them a mighty warrior to help. Only Buru had no idea what they were doing or what they were even talking about. Therefore, the deputy commander led the rescued peasants to the camp to question them about these lands. As expected, soldiers gathered at the entrance to the tent, curiously examining the foreign guests. Sarah became nervous under their scrutinizing gazes, but Veron swore to his niece that he would protect her no matter what happened. However, in response, the girl admitted that she had badly bruised her knee, so at least Veron should escape to warn the villagers. Veron was stunned by such a proposal and indignantly asked, how could he abandon his niece and run away? But before the girls could answer, Buru entered the tent and strictly ordered them to stop their chatter. And the soldiers behind him began to ask, why do the strangers have such pale skin and golden hair, and are all the local girls so beautiful? Sarah did not understand their language, but guessed that this was a punitive squad from the kingdom of Haiyan. But Veron doubted this, because there were no soldiers with black hair and dark eyes in the entire kingdom. Meanwhile, Buru noticed that the girl was clearly uncomfortable with such excessive attention, so he ordered the soldiers to leave. They did not risk incurring the deputy's wrath and quickly scattered. However, soon the tent was visited by the great Saja himself in the company of Huigaram. Chunchon asked the guests, do they understand them? However, Veron and Sarah remained silent, and then Buru admitted that he could not understand anything they were saying. Ignorance could cost the Goguryeo warriors their lives. They did not even know where they were, or who lived there, besides the walking boars and bulls. Therefore, it was vital to obtain information from the natives, and for that, it was necessary to master their language. But suddenly Uru declared that he had an idea, or rather, he had an assistant who knew all the languages of the world. This person turned out to be the swordsman Mount Kverion. Chunchon was surprised by such a candidate, but Uru assured that Kverion traded in the West with his merchant parents, thanks to which he learned all foreign languages. Chunchon decided to trust Uru's decision and ordered Kverion to try to talk to the locals. For Kverion himself, it was a chance to prove his worth, because there was no place he hadn't been, and no language he didn't know. And so he confidently approached Sarah and with a friendly smile said to her, "Buongiorno." However, in response, the girl only became more confused, and an awkward silence settled in the tent. Then Kverion waved to Sarah and said, "Hello," but the result was the same. And judging by the commander's expression, Kverion guessed that he was already beginning to lose patience. Then Kverion decided to try a welcoming kiss on the cheek, as the French do. However, Buru categorically did not like this idea, which made him angrily ask, "What the hell is he doing?" Kverion realized that his time and the patience of the great Saji were running out, so he began desperately listing all the foreign greetings he knew. This continued until Uru corrected the cerebellum of the hapless polyglot and then apologized to the commander for the whole circus. In response, Chuncheon said disappointedly that he had already forgotten that outside of battle, Kverion was useless. And Buru asked his brother, what was he thinking, introducing this swindler and upstart to everyone? But Uru said nothing in response, only silently dragged Kverion by the scruff. And when they both left the tent, Huigaram asked for permission to speak with the girl, to which Chuncheon did not object. Then the shaman of the Phantom Cavalry knelt before Sarah and, pointing to himself with a finger, pronounced his name syllable by syllable. It was then that Sarah understood that the man before her had introduced himself. Then Huigaram pointed to the girl with his hand and asked her name. And then in response, Sarah also introduced herself. Finally learning the name of the beauty, the soldiers rejoiced together. But perhaps the happiest of all was Buru. He also proudly declared that Sarah had learned his name before Huigaram's. Only the deputy did not realize that in the local language the word Buru means gratitude, not his name. One way or another, Chuncheon decided to end the acquaintance for today, and soon left the tent along with the other officers. Sarah and Veron were left alone, but her uncle was somewhat upset by the fact that everyone simply forgot about him. Night soon fell, but not only over the camp of the Goguryeo Empire. Besides them, a camp of the Kingdom of Haiyan was established in these lands. Baron Elvin managed this camp, who at the moment was occupied with his dinner. Behind him, like a shadow, stood Sir Hoikelum Tilumen, who commanded the Baron's knights. But suddenly a scout entered the tent and reported that mercenaries would soon capture the farmer's settlement. In response, the Baron grimaced with anger and hissed that since these parasites fled from the kingdom, he would make them regret it. The next morning for Chuncheon began, as usual, with listening to a report from Huigaram over breakfast. The great Saja inquired when the guests would leave their camp, to which Huigaram replied, "Today," and then added that Sarah got along well with Buru and Uru, so they were appointed as her escorts. Then in response, Chuncheon snorted and said that cleanliness and simplicity always go hand in hand. However, no sooner had he said this than in the next moment those very cleanliness and simplicity entered the tent, in the person of Sarah and Buru. Chuncheon ordered his deputy to go to the village to inform the residents that the Goguryeo warriors helped Sarah and her uncle. In response, Buru, clearly in high spirits, declared that the great Saja could rely on him. However, Chuncheon added that Captain of the Guard, Daimudok, would also go with him. Buru became worried from such news and still dared to ask the commander, does he really not trust him? Then Chuncheon had to explain that he had not stopped trusting his deputy, but Buru must focus on Sarah's safety in order to make a good impression. Uru will not be able to help his brother because he will guard Veron, so the captain of the guard will go with Buru. Now Buru understood everything and loudly laughed throughout the tent. Meanwhile, Chuncheon mentally added that he still only trusts his deputy in battle. However, it soon became clear that Daimudok was overwhelmed with work, so Chuncheon had no choice but to send the brothers without the captain's supervision. And now a small detachment under the command of Buru and Uru was heading to the farmer's village. The brothers even took captive orcs with them so that they would pull the cart with supplies for the locals as a gesture of goodwill. Soon the scout reported that he noticed a settlement ahead. Then Uru stopped the column and ordered Kverion to clarify with Veron, "Is this the village?" The swordsman conveyed Veron's words, and in response, he warned that the residents might be frightened by the armed detachment, so he and Sarah would go first and explain everything. The brothers did not object, and soon Veron with his niece reached the walls of their native settlement. However, Veron noticed that the village was too quiet, and all the inhabitants seemed to have disappeared somewhere. But then Sarah saw some kind of crowd on the main square. However, the next moment Veron covered her mouth and dragged her around the corner of the nearest house. Then he told his niece to be quiet, and he cautiously peeked out from behind the cover. Before Veron opened a frightening scene, armed mercenaries had driven all the villagers to the main square. The elder addressed the mercenary leader, whose name was Murin, and asked, "Why are they doing this?" In exchange for food and money, the mercenaries promised to stop the orc horde, but Murin said with a cruel smile that they would not risk their lives fighting the orcs. Then the mercenary leader pressed a knife to the elder's neck and added that instead they could easily earn money simply by capturing all the peasants. And the next moment, Murin ordered to kill everyone who was of no value. And at that very second, the mercenaries began beating the captured men and old men. The elder tried to rush to their aid, but Murin pinned him to the ground with his boot. And then the mercenary leader asked, "Is being eaten by orcs better than living as a slave?" The elder did not answer, but in his thoughts admitted that he had made a mistake by trusting strangers so easily. And he also prayed that Veron and Sarah would not return to the village, because at least these two had to be saved. Meanwhile, Veron ordered his niece to run back quickly, and inform their new friends about what was happening. Then Sarah asked her uncle what he was going to do, to which Varan honestly admitted that he intended to buy as much time as he could. However, the next moment behind his back, Sarah saw a tall shadow with horror. The mercenary beat Varan and dragged him along with Sarah right to the feet of the leader. As a reward for the successful find, Murin allowed him to be the first to have fun with the girl. Varan desperately tried to protect his niece but got kicked in the face, and then the mercenary dragged the resisting Sarah to a secluded place. However, the next moment a battle axe plunged into the scoundrel's skull and the mercenary crashed to the ground with a thud. Then both the mercenaries and the peasants saw a dwarf riding at full gallop. But Buru did not care about all their looks. He rushed through the crowd straight to Sarah. And then he dismounted and, kneeling before the girl, ordered her to take Verona away from here. Sarah helped her uncle to stand up, and none of the mercenaries dared to stop them from leaving. And only when Sarah and Verona had safely departed did Buru loudly give the command, to battle. And in the next moment, the riders of the Phantom Cavalry burst into the village. And then the deputy of the Great Saja gave his warriors the final instruction: spare no one who is armed. Obeying the will of their commander, the Koguryo riders engaged the mercenaries in battle, but the latter had no chance. Defeat was a matter of time, and realizing this, Murin quickly mounted his horse. His lieutenant suggested that this kingdom had sent a knightly order, but Murin stated that the punitive squad could not have arrived here so quickly. Moreover, the mercenary leader had never heard of such a knightly order either in the kingdom or on the entire continent. But suddenly the mercenaries who had mounted horses began to fall dead one after another. They were all struck down by enemy arrows, which made Murin decide that there were crossbowmen among their opponents. But how surprised he was when a detachment of ordinary archers rode into the village. For Murin, this was the last straw. He ordered his men to retreat and was the first to flee. But Buru noticed his escape and immediately gave chase. Then Murin ordered 3 riders to finish off the shorty. This was a huge mistake, because more than anything Buru hated being called shorty. For this, he knocked 2 mercenaries out of their saddles with one blow, and the third, Buru split in half along with his horse. At such a sight, Murin was horrified and ordered the remaining mercenaries to stop the dwarf at any cost. But Buru no longer pursued the fugitives. Throwing his axe over his shoulder, he acknowledged the mercenaries, for they fled skillfully. Then Buru ordered his warriors to deal with the remaining opponents, and at that very moment, riders of the Ghost Cavalry rushed towards the mercenaries. But then a lieutenant approached Buru and asked what to do with the escaped leader. However, Buru smirked and told him not to waste time on the coward, because Uru was already dealing with him. Meanwhile, Murin, sparing no horse, rushed to Baron Elvin's camp to report what had happened. However, in the next moment, 2 arrows pierced the mercenary's back, causing him to tumble off the horse. But even after that, Murin was still alive. Only not for long, because Uru had already drawn the next arrow on the bowstring. And when the mercenary leader was finished off, Uru ordered his warriors to return back. Meanwhile, mourning settled over the village. The peasants were grieving their killed husbands, sons, and fathers. Watching their sorrow with sympathy, Uru quietly said that the wildest creature of all is man. But then the village elder knelt before him and began to plead for mercy. Fortunately, Veron hurried to calm the residents and explained to them that these warriors had come to help them. The peasants could not believe his words, for they thought these were soldiers from the punitive detachment of the kingdom of Haiyan. Then Buru called Kverion to himself and ordered him to find a translator to accurately convey his words to the peasants. Meanwhile, Uru with his keen gaze noticed some movement in the forest thicket, so he declared that negotiations would have to wait. Buru immediately approached his brother and asked, what did he see? However, Uru did not have to answer, because in the next moment a whole horde of orcs appeared from behind the trees. But Buru did not lose his composure and at the same second sent a messenger to warn the Great Saja. Then he turned again to Kverion and ordered him to gather all the peasants who were able to hold a bow. Soon the order was carried out and Varan was appointed at the head of the new squad of archers. However, Uru assigned Kverion to him and ordered everyone to shoot only on his signal. Then Uru asked his warriors about the number of remaining arrows and, as it turned out, most had from 5 to 7 pieces. Meanwhile, the horde of orcs had already left the forest and rushed straight to the village gates. However, there they were already awaited by a wall of archers from Koguryo. And they were led by Uru, who loudly shouted to the archers, if each of their shots does not kill at least 2, they will all perish here. And in the next moment, he gave the signal and the archers, all as one, let loose arrows at the orcs. They struck the enemies with such swift speed that the peasants watching the battle did not even see them. And right after the archers, Buru entered the battle, leading the horsemen behind him. By that moment, the breathless messenger had already reached the camp. But while Chuncheon was only listening to his report, Buru with the horsemen were thinning the ranks of the orcs. The warriors of Goguryeo did not charge headlong, but attacked with raids. And when the horsemen retreated, their withdrawal was covered by archers. And soon this tactic turned the orcs to flight. Buru ordered the horsemen to drive them into the forest. However, in the next moment someone blocked the orc's path. And then from the forest darkness came an orc who was much larger than his comrades. It was their leader, Muqabal, who as a warning beheaded one of the deserters, and then growled that he would tear to pieces anyone who retreated before the humans. The orcs collectively froze, for fear of the leader outweighed fear of the Goguryeo warriors. And then Muqabal raised his battle axe and declared that as long as he was here, victory would be with the orcs. His battle cry inspired the orcs and awakened in them a thirst for blood. Then the leader ordered them to split into 4 squads and resume the attack on the village. Buru underestimated the enemy. He did not expect that among the orcs there would be a commander familiar with battle tactics. Therefore he immediately led the horsemen back to the village. At that time the orcs had already begun climbing over its wall. One of the peasants managed to impale an orc on a spear, but the orcs possessed extraordinary resilience. For his bravery, the peasant paid with his hand. However, in the next moment an arrow pierced the orc's forehead. It was Uru who hurried to help the peasant. But following one orc, 3 more appeared. Uru finished off one of them with a precise axe throw, and then ordered the wounded peasant to raise his spear. Through the pain, the man did as he was told, and behind Uru, 2 more spearmen joined. But suddenly Uru heard a woman scream. The orcs had already penetrated deep into the village and attacked the peasants. Fortunately, Buru and his axe arrived just in time to help. Both brothers engaged the orcs in battle, but the situation was dire. 200 dead were no place, and 4 more came from the forest. The brothers understood that at this pace they were unlikely to hold out until reinforcements arrived. However, they had no other choice, for fleeing from boars was unworthy of a warrior from Goguryeo. Therefore the brothers, Buru and Uru, accepted their last battle with smiles. But suddenly, a huge cloud of dust appeared in the distance and the sound of hundreds of hooves was heard. And when the dust cleared, both orcs and humans saw the full power of the phantom cavalry led by Chuncheon. The brothers were insanely happy to see the great Saja, for it meant their hunt for the boars would continue. Therefore, Querion and all the warriors of Goguryeo attacked the orcs with renewed strength. Meanwhile, Chuncheon ordered his riders to form a wedge. The phantom cavalry rushed straight at the orc army, and Muqabal watched their approach from the heights. However, despite the reinforcements, the orc chieftain was confident in his strength, for he had devoted his entire life to studying human battle strategy. And therefore Muqabal loudly declared that it does not matter how skilled the riders are, because they will never break through the wall of brave orcs. The chieftain called his kin to gather together, and they all began to carry out his will en masse. Only no one among the humans expected that the orcs would literally form a living wall. Huigaram was forced to admit that they would not be able to ram through such a formation. Only Chuncheon did not intend to attack the enemy head-on. At the very last moment he gave the command and the Goguryeo riders sharply flanked the orcs from both sides. Muqabal rejoiced, thinking that the human cavalry was fleeing from the indestructible wall of his orcs. But in reality, it was a diversionary maneuver to buy the archers time to prepare. And in the very next moment Uru ordered the archers to open fire. The clustered crowd of orcs became an easy target even for peasants. Struck by arrows, the orcs began to fall one after another, and soon their walls simply collapsed like a house of cards. And those orcs who escaped the arrows met the spears of the phantom cavalry. From this, Muqabal became furious and ordered the orcs to unite again into a wall. But the archers and horsemen did not allow them to do this. And in the next moment, a spear pierced Muqabal's chest. It was thrown by Chuncheon, and now everyone watched as the orc leader fell dead from the sheer cliff. The orcs were horrified by such a sight. Meanwhile, Chuncheon ordered the remaining enemies to be slaughtered. The Goguryeo horsemen began mercilessly carrying out the order. However, a few orcs still managed to escape into the forest. Nevertheless, the battle ended, and the peasants marked the victory with joyful shouts. Soon the great sage of Goguryeo visited the village for which his people risked their lives. The peasants met him warily, but the elder dared to be the first to greet his savior. Chuncheon ordered a translator to be brought, and Uru immediately called Querion. And when the swordsman approached Chuncheon, he ordered to tell the peasants that the phantom cavalry is leaving. Buru tried to persuade the commander, but Huigaram stopped his friend. Then the elder asked, "What will happen to the villagers if the warriors leave?" But in response, Chuncheon calmly and harshly stated that the peasants must protect their own lives. As soon as Querion translated his words, all the villagers immediately fell to their knees and began to beg for protection. However, in response, the great Saja coldly asked, "Do they want to become slaves?" At this question, the peasants fell silent, and then Chuncheon declared that the Goguryeo warriors live to protect their people and they will not shed blood to defend such weak-willed cowards. The peasants must defend their own territory, and money should be spent not on mercenaries, but on swords and armor, for lands protected by outsiders are doomed. And then the great Saja of Goguryeo drew his sword and swore that if the peasants take up arms, he will accept them as part of his people and family. However, in response, all the villagers remained silent. Then Chuncheon turned his horse and said in farewell that he would return for an answer. But suddenly, someone from the crowd shouted that they would take up the sword. And when Chuncheon turned around, he saw a boy who, though with difficulty, still raised the sword of his fallen father. The brave youth reminded Chunchan of a boy from his native world who wanted to fight the invaders from the Tang Empire. This memory made the great sage dismount and approach the young man. Then he showed the boy how to properly hold the sword and said that since he had taken the blade in his hands, he must live to protect his family. But as soon as Chunchan spoke these words, all the other peasants took up their tools after the boy. Then Chunchan kept his word and led not only his warriors but all the peasants out of the village. Soon the village was filled with crows that flew down to feast on the carrion. However, besides the scavengers, a punitive squad led by Tiliman also arrived in the village. But all the royal knights could find were hastily abandoned houses and many corpses everywhere. The scout reported the disappearance of the farmers personally to Baron Elvin, who was also accompanying the squad. The Baron asked Tiluman's opinion, to which the knight suggested that the orcs and mercenaries were killed by the same group. Then Elvin asked, could it be that the farmers killed the orcs and mercenaries and then disappeared? But in response, Tiluman admitted that he had never before seen arrows with black fletching, and therefore assumed that an unknown force was involved here. However, for the Baron, this fact could mean only one thing. He had competitors who coveted not his property. And so Alvin ordered his knights to track down the strangers and exterminate them all. Meanwhile, the ghostly cavalry safely returned to the camp. But as soon as Chunchan dismounted, Captain Daimodok immediately approached him and asked, "Who are all these refugees?" In response, the great Saja explained that from now on these peasants are part of Goguryeo. From these words, Daimodok had already decided that Chunchan was finally going to continue the lineage of the great emperor here. But he assured that he recognized these people as his own only because Goguryeo needed new warriors for defense, as well as women and children for whom these warriors would fight. However, Daimodok was supported by Huigaram, who advised Chunchan to listen to the captain and continue his lineage. But the great Saja was very stubborn. Instead of answering, he suggested that Huigaram himself become emperor. At this, Captain Daimodok lost patience and reminded Chunchan that now was not the time for jokes. However, he calmly stated that he had spent his whole life in battles and therefore was not strong in state affairs. An inept ruler destroys his own people, so Chunchan will do only what is within his power, and Captain Daimodok and Huigaram will take on what is within their power. With that, Chunchan closed the topic, but the next moment some shouts came from the side. The culprits of the commotion turned out to be 3 bearded men, only very short in stature. Seeing them, Buru asked his brother if these were their relatives, but Uru declared it nonsense. Meanwhile, Captain Daimodok told Chunchan that this trio belonged to the dwarf people, and they called themselves the Stone Brothers. The dwarves were pursued by orcs, but fortunately they came across a patrol that quickly dealt with the pursuers. The warriors of Goguryeo immediately noticed the resemblance between the strangers and the generals Buru and Uru, so they decided to bring the dwarves to the camp. At that moment, the great Saja was absent, so Captain Daimodok entrusted the trio to the care of Old Man Chan, who was the blacksmith of the Phantom Cavalry. And to his surprise, the guests immediately got to work and began managing the forge. The dwarves were very interested in studying the armor and weapons of the Phantom Cavalry, and the eldest of the trio discovered that the swords of the Goguryeo warriors had perfect balance and were forged from the purest iron without a single impurity. Soon the great Saja returned to the camp with the refugees, and then the dwarves saw the brothers Buru and Uru. The Trinity could not believe their eyes, for among their people there was a legend about the clan of Titans. Deciding that the twins were descendants of this legendary clan, the dwarves immediately fell prostrate before them. Not only the formidable Buru and Uru were thrown into confusion by this turn of events, but even the great Saja himself. When night fell on his camp, he decided to take a walk along the pier to clear his head and be alone with himself. Chunchan was a descendant of the great emperor, but as an illegitimate child, he spent half his life on the battlefield. The empire that Chunchan so desperately sought to protect burned down, and he could not even die alongside his comrades in arms. And that girl too. Although she was born in the imperial house, she cannot become an heir. Therefore, for her and all the warriors of Goguryeo, Chunchan must make a choice. If this is no longer their world, then continuing the history of the Goguryeo Empire will become his duty and the meaning of his life. With this thought, Chunchan smirked at the night sky and said that the die is cast. Within a month, he was patrolling the camp territory not as the great Saja, but as the new great emperor. He was accompanied by all the senior officers, Daimodok, Huigaram, and Buru with Uru. On the road, the shaman told Chunchan that at first the refugees were afraid of the warriors, but in just 1 month they became close friends. The food problem was solved thanks to the seeds brought by the farmers. As for the dwarves, they turned out to be not only blacksmiths but also skilled builders, so the housing problem resolved itself. Moreover, the dwarves were so impressed by their ironworking techniques that they now help old Chan in the forge. However, there was bad news. In a few days the wedding was to take place, but there was a shortage of clothes, drinks, and meat. Fortunately, Veron advised Huigaram to sell the skins and bones of creatures in the city to earn some money. Captain Daimudok immediately volunteered to carry out this task. However, Huigaram reminded the captain that he already had enough concerns in the camp, so the shaman suggested going to the city instead of him. Only Huigaram did not expect that the great Saja would have a better idea. By noon, Chuncheon, accompanied by Veron, Kverion, and Huigaram, reached the city walls. The shaman still could not resist asking, why this time did the great Saja decide to go on reconnaissance personally? Chuncheon did not answer the question, but Huigaram already understood that his commander was simply curious to see the city. The group of 4 headed to the city gates, unaware that they had an observer. At the city entrance, the Chuncheon squad was awaited by 2 guards. Entry was allowed only after checking documents and the cart with cargo, but Veron resolved this issue simply by bribing the guards. However, when the group of 4 had already entered the gates, one of the guards suddenly ordered Chuncheon to stop. The great Saja had to comply, and then the guard brazenly tore the hood off his head. At the sight of the foreigner with black hair and yellowish skin, the guard immediately became wary. But fortunately, Veron came to the rescue, offering the guard an additional payment for blindness and silence. The guard accepted the bribe, but before letting the strangers pass, he mockingly struck Chuncheon on the head with a spear. The great Saja endured this prank, but shortly after he asked Veron, what was the name of that guard? In response, Veron said that the guard's name was Irun Kalsuman, and then Chuncheon swore that he would remember this name well. Meanwhile, Huigaram felt that someone was following them. Soon the squad reached their destination, which turned out to be the shop of a merchant known to Veron. He was extremely surprised by his friend's catch, since an ogre and 24 soldiers would not have managed it. However, Veron quickly changed the subject and asked if the merchant also needed ogre blood. In response, the shop owner explained that only mages buy it, and since there are none in the city, the merchant has no need for it. But the next moment, a gray-bearded mage burst into the shop and declared from the threshold that he would buy ogre blood. The merchant and Veron were both stunned by such a coincidence, while the mage jumped to the crate and began inspecting the goods. Soon the elder declared that the blood was of excellent quality, and he was ready to pay 1 gold and 50 silver for 3 vials. However, the merchant apologized to the mage and explained that such a price was impossible. Then the elder offered all the money he had, but only for 1 vial. But unfortunately, the merchant remained adamant. Then the mage discarded politeness and angrily declared that he, Rizel, is a genius mage born only once a century. However, the merchant was unimpressed by the mage's words. Moreover, he reminded him that nobles shower gold even on 3rd circle mages, so Rizel must have savings. But if the mage is truly poor, then it means he is stuck only at the 1st circle. From these words, Rizel bent over as if he had been hit in the solar plexus. But in the next moment, he suddenly straightened up and a bright flame flared in his hand. And then Rizel loudly declared that although he had not reached enlightenment and was stuck on the 2nd circle, the merchant had committed a sin by insulting the mage. However, Rizel's fiery speech was interrupted by a mug that crashed right into his face. From the blow, the mage fell to the floor, and then the surrounding world was engulfed in darkness. And there in the darkness, Rizel dreamed of his youth. To master mana, Rizel needed only half a year instead of the standard 2. Becoming a great mage was only a matter of time, but when Rizel got stuck on the 1st circle, the mentor abandoned him. Rizel became an outcast, but continued to believe that there was a way out. He dedicated his life to study and gain knowledge worthy even of archmages. But still, Rizel could not conquer the 2nd circle. Now his life was literally in the hands of the great Saja of the Koguryo Empire. On the way to the camp, Huigaram asked, why are they returning earlier than expected because of that old man? Then Chuncheon explained that the sorcerers of these lands are very wise and valuable people, and therefore one of them would be useful to Goguryeo. But in the next moment, Rizel suddenly came to his senses. His hands were tightly bound, but a simple rope could not hold a mage. He did not know the people in front of him, but guessed that they were the ones who stunned him and then captured him. Therefore, Rizel did not hold back and responded to the offenders with an energy arrow. But how surprised the mage was when Chuncheon deflected the lightning with his bare hand, and Huigaram did not move at all. He just said the word block, and the lightning seemed to hit an invisible wall. After such a spectacle, Rizel realized that his kidnappers were not simple. So he activated a magical speech translation ring and asked the foreigners, "Who are you?" However, Chuncheon answered the question with a question. How does a sorcerer know their native language? Rizel had to explain that it was all because of a magical artifact. Then he turned to Huigaram and asked, how did he manage to dissipate the power of his energy arrow? But in response, Kvigaram only said that it was very rude to carelessly inquire about others' secret techniques. Rizel was about to object, but Kvigaram stopped him and ordered him to be silent. The reason was that their path was blocked by a gang of armed robbers, and they were led by the very guard at the gate, whose name was Kalsuman. Losing a steady source of income because of momentary greed was very foolish, but there were quite a lot of goods on the foreigner's wagon. Therefore, Kalsuman gave in to temptation and decided to seize the valuable cargo and simply get rid of its owners. But before Kalsuman could give the command to his thugs, two of them were suddenly engulfed in flames. It was the work of Kavigaram and his magical scrolls. Meanwhile, Chuncheon said to Kalsuman with a sinister smile that he had a very familiar face. In response, Kalsuman ordered the other thugs to finish off the foreigners. But at that very second, Kvigaram threw 3 more magical scrolls, and 3 more robbers were consumed by flames. Ignoring the people burning alive, Chuncheon leisurely headed straight towards Kalsuman. One bandit dared to block the path of the great Saja, but immediately paid with his life. At such a sight, the remaining bandits instantly lost all their courage. Kalsuman urged them to attack, but in the next moment Hwigaram deprived him of his last comrades. Now Kalsuman was left one-on-one with Chuncheon. Fear paralyzed the guard, and now all he could do was helplessly watch as Chuncheon raised his sword. However, instead of a deadly blow, he suddenly struck Kalsuman on the head with the flat side of the blade. Then Chuncheon even crouched down in front of the guard and continued to shower him with steel slaps. It is unknown how long this torture would have lasted if Hwigaram had not hurried his commander. Reluctantly, he obeyed the shaman and suddenly pulled a magical scroll from under his cloak. Then Chuncheon pronounced the spell of tearing fire, and the scroll in his hand immediately flared with blue flames. And Kalsuman suddenly screamed in pain, shuddered all over, and fell dead to the ground. However, Chuncheon was dissatisfied with the result of the spell and admitted with annoyance that magic was not really his forte. Then Kavigaram calmed his commander and stated that if everyone could easily do magic, then it would not be magic. Meanwhile, Rizel, observing from the side, wondered, how could this foreigner use magic by uttering only a keyword? But then he noticed that his kidnappers were heading towards the Laganza mountain range, where a dragon dwells. It was then that Rizel guessed that the foreigner before him was the dragon who had taken the form of an ordinary man. If Rizel could become the dragon's servant, then with his help he could advance to the second circle. Meanwhile, Kvigaram approached the mage and with a smile asked for forgiveness for the inconvenience and kidnapping. However, in response, Rizel assured that he was ready to carry out any order of the Lord. Such a change in behavior surprised Kvigaram and Chuncheon. But on the other hand, it would be easier for them if the mage voluntarily followed them. By morning, the great Saja returned to his camp, and Rizel was amazed at how well organized the settlement in the Laganza Mountains was. And the soldiers of Goguryeo with their discipline and spirit could rival the royal ones. But Rizel was even more amazed when he saw 2 dwarves from the Titan clan, which was considered extinct after the Divine Demonic War 1,000 years ago. However, then Chuncheon asked the mage, had he forgotten how he tried to harm Veron? In his defense, Rizel explained anxiously that he only intended to teach a lesson to the insolent merchant who insulted him. But Chuncheon did not want to hear anything, and ordered Buru and Uru to take the mage to the place of execution. The brothers immediately carried out the will of the great Saja, and soon he appeared before the accused, dressed in the emperor's robes. Chuncheon could not forgive Rizel's attempt to harm his guide and one of the subjects of the Goguryeo Empire. The mage tried again to explain that it was all just a misunderstanding, and he did not intend to harm Veron. However, Chuncheon was adamant and declared that the mage insulted him by trying to harm his subordinate. Rizel was about to object, but Chuncheon raised his voice and said that the matter was not that good punishes evil, but that the strong take everything, such as natural selection. However, in response, Rizel dared to say that he was kidnapped, so he was forced to defend himself. But Chuncheon had a different opinion. Moreover, he admitted that he could have simply ordered his men to kill Rizel on the spot. Besides, he turned out to be weak and even as a mage did not command respect. From these words, Rizel felt truly miserable because they were true. The mage had lived all 75 years in vain. But then the great Saja asked Rizel, would he continue to live wandering like a beggar and enduring insults? Or would he tie his fate to the Goguryeo Empire? Rizel was confused by the question and clarified what exactly Chuncheon meant. Then he had to explain that Goguryeo did not need an outstanding mage, but a sage possessing deep knowledge about this world. Then the great Saja approached Rizel and asked one last time, would he accept the offer? The mage did not dare to look at Chuncheon, but still dared to ask, what was the Goguryeo Empire ready to do for him? Then in response, Chuncheon declared that one should not stand aside when someone offends his family and subordinates. And therefore if anyone dares to look down on Rizel, the Goguryeo Empire will grind the insolent into dust. After these words, Rizel respectfully bowed before the great Saja and swore that he would serve him as his mentor. Chuncheon was satisfied with this answer, and then he declared that from this moment Rizel would teach Buru and Uru. The brothers were stunned by such news, but the great Saja insisted that his generals must master the local language. This also applied to Rizel. Instead of relying on the power of the artifact, he must learn the language of the Goguryeo Empire. And until then, the Ring of Magic translation would stay with Chuncheon. Rizel expected to be treated like a simple servant. However, he could not have foreseen that he would be entrusted with teaching 2 generals of the Goguryeo army. Only the students from Buru and Uru were hopeless. At midnight, Rizel was visited by the great Saja to inquire about the progress in training. And also Chunshin suddenly returned the mage his ring and reported that it was broken. Rizel immediately checked the artifact, but the magical translation ring was intact. The mage wanted to explain to Chuncheon that to activate the artifact it was necessary to pronounce a spell, but he had already left. Meanwhile, Veron and Kverion had already finished all their business in the city, and were now returning to the camp. However, Kverion's sharp hearing caught something that made him stop the cart. Then the swordsman quickly dismounted and pressed his ear to the ground. Veron asked anxiously what was happening, but instead of an answer, Kverion declared that they would abandon the wagon immediately. Veron did not argue and silently took cover with Kverion in the forest, but not far from the road. And very timely, because soon a detachment of Baron Elvin's knights approached the abandoned cart. After inspecting the cart, the lieutenant ordered his men to disperse and search for the fugitives. The knights immediately began to inspect the surroundings, and 2 of them headed straight to Verona's shelter with Kverion. Veron was already prepared to say goodbye to life, but to his surprise, Kverion instantly finished off the first knight and captured the second. Pressing the blade to the knight's neck, Kverion promised that if he answered his questions honestly, he could return home to his wife and children. Only the knight warned in response that he had no wife. Kverion pretended not to hear this and asked, "Why are the knights looking for them?" In response, the knight explained that an order had come from the kingdom of Hyen to recruit soldiers, so Baron Elvin was rounding up peasants to meet the quota. Now Kverion understood why the mercenaries had captured Verona's village, and therefore he had to report this to the great Saja as soon as possible. The knight answered the question honestly, so Kverion decided to honestly keep his promise. However, he forbade the knight from returning the same way and, pointing in another direction, ordered him to go until he counted to 1,000. The knight rejoiced at his luck and obediently ran in the indicated direction. However, soon a scream full of horror came from behind the trees. The knight did not know that there was a cliff in that direction, but Kverion did. Nevertheless, he did not feel any pangs of conscience because he had fulfilled the given promise. Only Kverion did not think that the knight's death cries would attract his comrades. Meanwhile, a very worried Sarah visited Buru. The girl asked when her uncle would return, to which Buru replied that Veron would arrive tomorrow morning. However, from Sarah's anxious face, Buru understood that his words did not comfort the girl much. Then he directly asked what was troubling her, to which Sarah admitted that the road at night was dangerous because of the punitive squads. However, in response to the girl's concerns, Buru suddenly laughed loudly. And then, through laughter, he explained that Sarah should not worry so much because her uncle was Kverion, who was nicknamed the Battle Doll. And at that very moment, Kverion was ready to confirm his nickname once again. As soon as he drew his sword, the knights all rushed into attack as a crowd. But Kverion in the blink of an eye moved behind their backs and with a single swing of his sword, beheaded all the knights at once. At such a sight, Veron was stunned until Kverion urged him to hurry. But no sooner had he taken a step than the forest shook with a thunderous roar. And then a 2-headed ogre emerged from behind the trees. He was considered the king of all land monsters, but Veron assumed that if Kverion could kill all the knights with one blow, he could handle the ogre as well. But when Veron turned around, he only saw Kverion running away, flashing his heels. Meanwhile, a meeting of the high officers was taking place in the Koguryo camp. However, it was soon interrupted by an urgent report. Smoke was seen above the northern border tower. This meant that something had happened in the village of farmers with whom Koguryo traded. The village was half the day's journey away, so Chuncheon ordered to leave minimal guards in the camp, and for everyone else to prepare for the march. In the next moment, the Koguryo camp came alive and buzzed with activity. The confused Rizel rushed to Chuncheon's tent to find out why the assembly had begun. But how surprised the mage was when he saw a battle-ready detachment already in front of the great Saja's tent. Rizel had traveled across the entire continent, but had never before seen such disciplined troops. Meanwhile, Shunshin came out to the warriors and ordered Uru to take a mage with him. Then the great Saja personally addressed Rizel and asked, had he ever been on a battlefield? In response, the mage admitted that in his long life he had participated in wars more than once. Then Chuncheon ordered him to observe today's battle, and afterwards report on how the fighting style of Goguryeo differs from that of this kingdom. And then the camp gates swung open, and the great Saja ordered the ghostly cavalry to advance. Meanwhile, chaos and despair reigned in the northern village of the farmers. Baron Elvin ordered his knights to drive all the useless people into the village, except men capable of fighting and young women. And then he ordered the archers to burn the settlement to the ground along with its inhabitants. However, this village seemed too small to Baron Elvin. Then Tuluman reported that the prisoners spoke of a larger settlement located very nearby. At this news, Baron Elvin smiled bloodthirstily and declared with anticipation that the hunt would be fun. Meanwhile, Veron and Kveron managed to hide from the 2-headed ogre. However, soon they were tracked down by another monster called a goblin. Kverion noticed him too late, for which he paid, receiving a stone to the forehead. Veron tried to say something important, But Kverion did not listen and kicked the goblin back with all his might. Only after that did Varan manage to explain that it was a goblin baby, and it would be better not to touch it. And in the next moment, Kverion understood why. A whole crowd of angry goblins appeared from behind the trees. By that time, the ghostly cavalry of Koguryo had reached the northern village of the farmers. More precisely, what was left of it. Unfortunately, there was no one left to save. Chuncheon ordered Huigaram to make a halt and post sentries. But then Rizel approached the great Saja with one of the enemy's arrows, and reported that judging by the emblem on the tip, it was the personal punitive squad of Baron Elvin. Chuncheon had heard that the Baron rarely visits these lands, so he became curious why. Then Rizel explained that the reason was the fierce monsters living here, and sending an army against them would mean huge losses. Since the city at the foot of the Laganza Mountains is a trading one, many want to buy their way out of conscription. Therefore, in the kingdom of Heian, it is common to buy slaves to send them to war instead of their own sons. And it seems that Baron Elvin plans to use the farmers exactly in this way. Chuncheon called it madness and stated that in this way the kingdom of Heian would never win. But in response, Rizel revealed that everything was much worse, because the kingdom simply did not care, whether it won or lost. All because the kingdom of Heian was squeezed between giant empires. On land it bordered two great powers, and across the sea, a maritime empire. Therefore, the kingdom always depended on the whims and demands of strong neighbors. At the beginning of each war, it survived by supplying troops to both sides, so it does not matter who wins and who loses. Such is the reality of the kingdom of Heian. After these words, Chuncheon finally understood that no one protected these lands, because the kingdom had already abandoned its statehood. But suddenly a scout ran up to the great Saja and reported that an enemy camp had been discovered, with about 20 horsemen and 600 infantrymen. The scouts also saw about 200 people locked in cages in the camp. Most likely, the punitive detachment of Baron Elvin decided to rest before the raid on the next village. The scouts' report ended there, and then Chuncheon ordered his warriors to prepare for the offensive. Meanwhile, in Baron Elvin's camp, knights were cruelly mocking the captured peasants. They beat the men with whips to intimidate and break them, and the knights decided to amuse themselves and violate the women. But not everyone had fun that night. The sentries were forced to keep watch far from the camp. They became the first victims of the Koguryo scouts. When the last sentry was done away with, Huigar ordered to send the signal. One of the scouts immediately released 2 pigeons into the sky. This meant that all escape routes were blocked. Meanwhile, far from the camp, Chuncheon noticed the signal. But before starting the attack, the great Saja ordered Rizel to carefully watch their battle. And only then did Chuncheon draw his sword. And at that very second, all the Koguryo archers drew their arrows to the bowstrings. Baron Elvin's men continued to drink and have fun sitting by the fire. Suddenly, a stout blonde man tore himself away from his mug of drink and suspiciously began to peer into the night sky. An unusual whistling sound joined the general noise. No matter how the man looked, he could not find the source of the whistle, but it was definitely not a bird. The man's eyes widened with horror when he finally realized what exactly was making that strange sound. But it was already too late. A hail of arrows pierced every warrior by the campfire, leaving no chance of survival. A commotion immediately broke out in the camp. Soldiers quickly grabbed their weapons, not fully understanding where exactly the attack was coming from. Amid all the noise, Baron Elvin ran out of his tent wearing only a nightshirt. He was extremely surprised by what was happening and immediately demanded explanations. But the soldiers, not even sparing the Baron a glance, continued to run chaotically around the camp searching for the enemy, too occupied with their own survival. Finally, the Baron's loyal knight Teluman rushed up to him. He immediately asked Elvin to take shelter in the tent and remain calm as it was quite dangerous outside. Despite the warning, Baron Elvin did not hurry. Carefully observing the general chaos, he demanded that Teluman immediately take control of the situation. Only after that did Baron Elvin decide to hide in the tent, and Teluman immediately began issuing orders to his subordinates. Teluman was extremely irritated by the outcome of events. Who could dare to attack them? After a few minutes, Teluman managed to take control of the situation. The spearmen lined up in 2 ranks at the camp entrance, the archers positioned behind them and were ready to open fire. Everyone, waiting, began to peer into the night gloom, hoping to catch a glimpse of the enemy. And then, to everyone's surprise, the enemy cavalry appeared on the horizon. Teluman immediately decided that their opponents were not among the villagers, but they also did not resemble a regular army. A satisfied smile played on his face when he saw that the riders were aiming at them with bows. Could it be that the enemy was unaware that shooting from horseback reduces accuracy? Nevertheless, Teluman immediately gave the order to the archers to draw their bows and shoot as soon as the enemy was within striking distance. But the first to shoot was Chuncheon along with his horsemen. Yet this did not scare Teluman at all, since it was impossible to hit from such a distance. Nevertheless, instincts prevailed, and Teluman was able to dodge an arrow flying straight at him at the last moment. Looking back, he was horrified. The first row of his archers had been struck by enemy arrows, but this simply could not be. Without wasting time, Chuncheon drew his bowstring again, intending to hit Tillman after all. But as before, he still managed to deflect the attack. Unfortunately, behind him the death moans of his archers were heard again. In a fury, Tillman ordered the spearmen to immediately block the enemy cavalry. The soldiers immediately thrust their spears forward, awaiting the clash with the horses. But Chuncheon intended to break through the enemy formation using a wedge. The horsemen immediately took the necessary formation, and the great Saja himself took the lead. At full gallop, the cavalry charged into the defensive line, easily crushing everything in their path. Tillman was horrified by what was happening and shouted with all his might for the soldiers to attack the horses. The mustached soldier, who was closest to Chuncheon, tried to attack the great Saja's horse, but the spear only treacherously slid off the armor. Only then did the soldier realize that the horses were fully clad in iron. But it was already too late. A second later, his skull was crushed under the horse's hooves. The soldiers in the camp fled in terror, begging for mercy. But the horsemen had no intention of stopping, let alone pitying their opponents, for they had come here to save the tillers of the soil. The horsemen under the command of Chuncheon rushed deep into the camp, while Buru remained to command the detachment of infantrymen who had already managed to approach the camp. Under the cover of shield-bearers, Buru's detachment followed the horsemen, but met fierce resistance from the camp defenders. A battle broke out. Nevertheless, the warriors of Goguryeo managed to push back the enemy despite being outnumbered. Baron Elvin ran out of the tent again. He could not understand where such a large army had come from, since judging by the armor, they did not belong to the Imperial Army. With a sword in his hands, Tillman immediately ran up to the Baron, insisting that Elvin retreat. Understanding the seriousness of the situation, Baron Elvin agreed with him. Nevertheless, he promised to return for his soldiers and bring the royal army as reinforcements. One of the soldiers who was supposed to secure the retreat path ran up to them shouting, and reported that all the routes out of the camp were blocked. Meanwhile, Kvigaram, with a small detachment, was pressing the mercenaries who guarded the cages with prisoners. A handful of mercenaries, realizing that the situation was turning against them, decided to flee, but Chuncheon with his horsemen immediately appeared to oppose them. Seeing that the situation was under control, Chuncheon ordered Huigarum to guard the wagons, while he with the cavalry would help Buru deal with the remaining enemy. Suddenly, one of the mercenaries, who seemed to have already accepted defeat, grabbed a torch and rushed to the cages with prisoners intending to burn them. Desperate cries of the nephews sounded. They realized the hopelessness of the situation. Cursing to himself, Kvigaram realized his miscalculation and what it could threaten him with in the future. Without hesitation, he raised his hand and recited a spell. The torch in the mercenary's hands flared brighter. Then the flame engulfed the mercenary and the wretched screams of the unfortunate sounded. It did not last long. After a few seconds, the flame died out, and only a charred skeleton remained of the mercenary. Baron Elvin Tillman and a handful of soldiers lucky enough to survive were surrounded by a tight ring of Koguryo warriors. Tillman realized the situation they found themselves in. Out of 600 soldiers, only 100 survived the attack. Then Baron Elvin decided to use the last trump card up his sleeve. Stepping forward, he loudly declared that he was a nobleman of the kingdom of Haiyan, and such treatment of his person was unacceptable. The Koguryo warriors froze in place, and a satisfied smile appeared on Baron Elvin's face. He decided to press the advantage while it seemed to be on his side. It turns out these warriors knew the laws of war. Feeling confident, Baron Elvin immediately demanded the commander to appear. The Koguryo warriors parted, and Chuncheon approached the Baron on horseback. As expected, Baron Elvin introduced himself and expected his interlocutor to show the same courtesy. But to his surprise, Chuncheon ignored him. Turning around, Chuncheon inquired where Kaverian was now. Sighing heavily, Buru reported that he had not yet returned from the village. Then the great Saja asked Rizel, who was nearby, for the magical communication ring. The old mage immediately obeyed his lord's command, but for the ring to work it was necessary to say the activation phrase. Raising his hand, Chuncheon said, "Activation phrase," but nothing happened. Then he tried to address Baron Elvin, but from his facial expression it became clear that the ring did not work. Rizel said embarrassedly that the great Saja said the wrong words, and then asked Chuncheon to repeat exactly after him. The old mage said, "Interpretation," and again lowering his hand, Chuncheon tried to say the required word, but to his shame he failed on the first attempt. The outcome of the battle was already decided, so Tillman asked the Baron for permission to take the situation into his own hands. Elvin looked at his knight with interest. Could he have a better plan? Bowing his head, Tillman immediately explained the essence of his plan, and a satisfied smile appeared on Baron Elvin's face. Meanwhile, Rizel reminded again that Chuncheon must repeat the word exactly. Finally, the great Saja managed to say the word interpretation, and the ring immediately glowed pale blue. Rizel clapped his hands joyfully. Chuncheon again addressed the Baron, asking if he understood his speech. Elvin nodded affirmatively. Then Tillooman stepped forward and introduced himself as a knight of Baron Elvin's house. In turn, Chuncheon declared that he was a messenger of the great Goguryeo Empire. The last words made Tillooman think. There was no country with a similar name on this continent, yet they dared to call themselves an empire. Of course, Chuncheon assumed that since Tillooman stepped forward, he wished to continue the battle. But the outcome of the further battle was already clear to Tillooman, so he asked Chuncheon to duel him. At first, the great Saja hesitated, but then he accepted the challenge after all, since before him stood a knight. Tillooman thanked Chuncheon for the honor. Baron Elvin's face spread into a satisfied smile. It turned out Tillooman was right, and the Empire's envoy accepted the challenge. The Baron had no doubt about Tillooman's victory, as he was a renowned swordsman. He also hoped to turn the tide of the battle by taking Chuncheon hostage. Dismounting, Chuncheon passed unhindered through the ring of knights protecting Baron Elvin. Roaring fiercely, Tillooman drew his sword, and its blade immediately was engulfed in a bright glow. Rizel even opened his mouth in surprise, for it was an aura. What was a man with the rank of royal guard doing in such a wilderness? Chuncheon also drew his blade and urged Tillooman to attack, while Rizel advised dodging the attacks, since the opponent possessed an aura. But it was already too late. Tillooman raised his blade and rushed into the attack, intending to end the fight with a single strike. Chuncheon managed to react. There was a clang of metal, and Tillooman's sword split in half. Tillooman stared in horror at what was formerly called a sword. He could not understand how this could have happened. The sword of Chuncheon radiated an aura, although he did not even direct it. Baron Elvin rushed fearfully to his knight, trying to find out if he was all right. But to his surprise, Tillooman did not respond, frozen in place. Approaching closer, Elvin cautiously touched the knight. Tillooman made gurgling sounds, and then his body split into two equal halves. Warm blood splashed onto the Baron. Stepping back, he collapsed to the ground. His face was distorted with a grimace of horror. Above him immediately loomed the terrifying figure of Chuncheon. At that moment, he looked more like a monster than a man. Out of fear, Baron Elvin even wet himself. Rizel, who was carefully watching the duel, finally realized that the invisible surge of mana at the moment far exceeded a simple aura. That was why Tillooman lost. Turning around, Chuncheon gave the order for the army to return home, and the soldiers marched back in formation. Slowly trailing behind, Rizel pondered what kind of place this was. The Goguryeo Empire? The sun was already high in the sky, and the riders still continued their journey. Among the warriors was Rizel. He was lost in thought and noticed nothing around. Rizel knew better than anyone what was happening on the continent, but he had never heard of an army with such military power as the warriors of the Goguryeo Empire. Uru, noticing the teacher's inner turmoil, rode up to him and asked what was happening. Then Rizel decided to ask after all. From where exactly did the Goguryeo troops come to the continent? Uru did not quite understand the essence of the question, since it was obvious that they came from the Goguryeo Empire. But Rizel meant something slightly different. He was more interested in exactly where the empire was located. Here Uru pondered. They had just been sailing on the ship for 3 days, that's all. Rizel, however, knows his camp's location, so why such questions? Of course, Rizel already understood that the interlocutor was not particularly smart, since the lake is quite a closed body of water. So how did they sail for 3 days? This question stunned Uru, so he had to explain in detail how they broke through the raging sea. Hearing the story, Rizel was amazed at how the warriors could get caught in a storm and end up in the lake of the Laganza Mountains, yet he still had some suspicions. Finally, the horsemen reached the fortress gates, and one of the warriors, announcing the arrival of the great Saji, immediately demanded the guards to open the gates. When the gates were already open and the procession was ready to enter the protected territory, a cry suddenly came from the forest, growing louder and louder. The source of such a loud sound turned out to be Kverion, who, bursting out of the forest, rushed towards Chuncheon. Running up, he immediately dropped to one knee and reported that troops had set out from the city to capture the peasants, so it was necessary to urgently gather forces. Having listened carefully to the report, Chuncheon, measuring Kverion with a dissatisfied look, did not deign to answer him. Then Kverion, lowering his head again, said that he had ridden day and night without rest to report this to the great Saje. Nevertheless, Chuncheon, without uttering a word, moved towards the fortress. Kverion, not understanding, remained watching him go. Buru immediately drove up to him and explained that they had just returned after killing all the enemies, so Kverion was late with the report. Buru also advised Kverion to change clothes, as he looked extremely miserable. The sun was already setting when Kverion appeared before Chuncheon and reported everything that had happened to him during that time. How he bravely killed all the pursuers and then managed to escape from 1,000 orcs who were chasing him. Nevertheless, Chuncheon was not impressed by the story. Kverion simply threw away everything he had bought with the money earned from selling the skins they had collected for months, and just ran away. Only now did Kverion fully realize how his feet looked from the outside, and began quietly cursing Baron Elvin, because of whom he got into such trouble. Hearing the Baron's name, Chuncheon ordered Huigaram to immediately bring the prisoner. A few minutes later, 2 guards brought Baron Elvin. He looked miserable, his hands were tied, and his nightshirt still smelled of urine. Despite his situation, Baron Elvin immediately stated that a nobleman of the kingdom should not be treated this way. According to international law, he must be treated according to his status. Then Chuncheon gave a meaningful look to the old mage as if asking if this was true. And Rizel immediately nodded, confirming every word of the Baron. Since decorum demanded it, Chuncheon nevertheless decided to give Baron Elvin a worthy reception. As ransom, the Baron offered 1,000 gold coins. Moreover, he could ask the king to grant independence to this region. The proposal made this great Saju think, because they really needed a place where they could settle down. So the phrase about independence sounded very timely. Moreover, Baron Elvin understood that the army of the Koguryo Empire had not yet sworn allegiance to anyone, so he was ready to take them under his command. Hearing this, Buru and Uru immediately drew their weapons, intending to behead the insolent who dared to defy their ruler. But Chuncheon quickly tempered their ardor, strictly ordering them not to dare be rude to Baron Elvin. Reluctantly, the brothers still had to obey. Chuncheon immediately returned to the Baron's proposal. Alvin also promised to ensure them the best reception. And then the great Saja pondered, while Baron Elvin began to rejoice mentally, for if he played everything correctly, he would not only get out of here, but also receive elite troops. Finally, after thinking everything over carefully, Chuncheon apologized to Baron Elvin for the inconvenience caused and ordered the guards to release him immediately. Rubbing his numb hands quite a bit, Baron Elvin said that for a talent like Chkunchkon, he was ready to endure even greater troubles. The great Saja thanked the Baron again for his boundless generosity. But, as it seemed to him, there was still one more problem. Chunchkona was worried that his subordinates might encounter the Baron's soldiers on his lands, and that this could escalate into a serious conflict. But Baron Elvin assured that it was not a problem, since now only the guard remained on his territory. Moreover, he personally commands it, so no problems should arise. Chuncheon was also worried about the provisions, because the large number of warriors could cause problems with them. But even this the Baron did not consider a problem, for his estate had enough supplies to support an army for more than half a year. Satisfied with the answers, Chkuncheon thanked Baron Elvin once again and suggested he rest. When the formalities were over, Chkuncheon ordered the guards to remove the communication ring from the Baron's neck. As soon as the guards carried out the order, and the Baron could no longer understand what those around him were saying, the great Saja ordered Elvin to be taken to the captive peasants. The guards nodded affirmatively, and immediately escorted Baron Elvin out the door. As soon as the order was executed, Rizel immediately asked why Chkuncheon acted this way, since the Baron would surely be beaten to death there. Smiling quite contentedly, the great Saja replied that if Baron Elvin died, then that was his fate. Then he ordered Huigaram to gather the army. The day after tomorrow morning they would set out. He only nodded affirmatively. Rizel did not quite understand why Chkuncheon needed soldiers, since there were almost no troops left on the Baron's territory. A malicious smile ran across Chkuncheon's face. In fact, he wanted Kaverion to return the principal amount in interest for the lost cart. Moreover, since there were almost no troops left on the Baron's territory, they had a chance to make a good profit, because the most fun in war is looting. When the cage door slammed shut, Baron Elvin was beside himself with anger. How dare these ragamuffins treat their future lord this way? The guards, not deigning to answer the Baron, withdrew. Then the Baron supposed that perhaps it was some kind of mistake. But realizing the harsh reality, Baron Elvin kicked the wooden bars of the cage in frustration. Do these savages even understand how things are done? Looking around, the Baron finally realized that he was not alone in the dungeon. A couple of dozen eyes cast an unfriendly glance at Elvin. These were the very plowmen whom Alvin had personally captured not long ago, the irony being that the Baron himself ended up in captivity. The prisoners did not react at all to the Baron's appearance. Only their gaze revealed all the hatred that the people felt towards Elvin. A stocky blond man took out a wineskin and was about to properly quench his thirst, but Elvin immediately demanded the wineskin for himself. The man did not utter a word and looked contemptuously at Baron Elvin, but did not move from his place. The Baron was annoyed by the peasant's stupidity. Sighing heavily, Alvin approached the fair-haired man and with a kick sharply knocked the wineskin out of his hands. From the unexpected blow, the man staggered and fell to the ground, and Alvin, without wasting time, began to brutally beat the poor fellow with his feet. The blond man tried to defend himself from the blows as best he could and kept begging for mercy, but the Baron was deaf to his pleas. Theodore could no longer watch the beating and was about to rush to help the fair-haired man, but Simon sharply stopped his friend, reminding him that the guards would kill them if Baron Elvin got hurt. Before Theodore's eyes, scenes of the recent horror that the Baron and his men had wrought in his village surfaced. Isn't Simon and the others at all angered that even in such a situation Baron Elvin allows himself to behave this way? Although the others present were ashamed, they could do nothing, so they could only silently observe what was happening. Finally finishing this beating, Baron Elvin laughed heartily. Even now, he was above all these nobodies. Theodore was not satisfied with this state of affairs. Breaking free from Simon's grasp, he jumped at the Baron and struck him in the face. From surprise and audacity, Baron Elvin did not manage to defend himself. Blood immediately poured from his broken nose, and staggering, Elvin fell to the ground, painfully hitting his head on the wooden bars. After regaining some composure, Baron Elvin began to scream for the guards, but no one intended to come at his cries. Turning around, the Baron smiled kindly as much as his battered face allowed and asked for forgiveness. But Theodore did not want apologies. He wished for Elvin to atone for his guilt with death. And raising his hand, he began mercilessly beating the Baron. The next day, all those who were in the cage stood before the great Saja, who together with his advisors, was seated on a wooden platform. The guards also brought Theodore, whose hands were tied. Beside the covered cloth lay the mutilated body of Baron Elvin. Glaring sternly at the man, Chunchun inquired why Theodore had killed the Baron. But Theodore only silently looked at Chunchun. Then the guards, deciding that it was too bold not to answer the ruler, knocked him to the ground and began kicking him. When the guards finished, Chunchun repeated his question again, to which Theodore replied that he simply destroyed the enemy. This answer pleased Chunchun, and a satisfied smile lit up his face, for revenge is the right of every person. Then he asked everyone who was in the cage who among them had raised a hand against Baron Elvin. Theodore cried out in despair that only he was involved in the death of Baron Elvin. All the others tried to stop him. That was enough for Chunchun. The guards immediately grabbed Theodore and dragged him away. Buru immediately followed them. The great Saja, smiling, said that the life of one nobleman is worth more than the lives of 10 parasites, and that is exactly what the prisoners are. Therefore, Chunchun offered the other 9 parasites to die voluntarily, and the rest he would turn into slaves. Although the great Saja offered life to all the others in exchange for 9 sacrifices, no one volunteered. Suddenly Simon rose from his knees and, despite his family's protests, asked if it was really impossible to manage with only them. But Chunchun firmly decided that there must be 9 sacrifices. When the guards were taking Simon away, he turned to the great Saja. He hoped that even if the required number was not reached, his family would still be spared. When Simon disappeared from sight, Chunchun again addressed the crowd. There were still 8 people left. One by one, the men stood up and offered themselves as victims. But when there were still 4 volunteers to be gathered, the crowd suddenly fell silent. No one else wanted to die. People shamefully hid their eyes. They were ashamed of their weakness. Chunchun was very dissatisfied with this outcome. He ordered Huigaram to provide housing and means of subsistence for the families of those who sacrificed themselves. From now on, they will become subjects of the Goguryeo Empire. As for the rest, Chunchun ordered them to be locked back in the cages. Every single one of them is now a slave. Finally coming to his senses, Theodore, not fully understanding what was happening at all, tried to get up, but a sharp pain below his back made him lie down again. Looking around, Theodore noticed Varon sitting near his bunk and tried to find out from him what was going on. Varon, smiling, explained that it was all a test. Everyone who volunteered to sacrifice themselves became people of the Goguryeo Empire along with their families, while the rest became slaves. Theodore was extremely surprised by this turn of fate, as he was sure he had died. After all, the pain he felt before losing consciousness was real. It seems Chunchun never intended to kill anyone, but only wanted to check if there was even a drop of will in the peasants. However, to make everything look real, Buru gave each of the victims a jab with the axe blade in the butt. The next day, Buru and Sarah, sitting on a stone, watched as the slaves, under the guard's supervision, worked the field. Suddenly, Sarah decided to ask why these people decided to become slaves. At first, Buru thought, then answered that the most important thing for a person is the ability to wield a sword. These people refused to take up arms, that is why they became slaves. After all, if a person cannot sacrifice themselves in peacetime, nothing will change when the enemy attacks. Once Burr asked a similar question to the great Saje, to which Chunchun replied that anyone can survive, but not everyone can enjoy freedom. Even wild animals understand what freedom is, and are ready to do anything for it. Therefore, people must always remember why they take the sword in their hands. Just like that, without a reason, it is impossible to become strong. To protect one's freedom, a person must take up the sword, but for that, he must understand freedom. The ghostly cavalry galloped briskly through the forest under the cover of night. Suddenly, an order to stop was heard, and everyone immediately froze in place as one. Rizel, who was also among the horsemen, decided to take the opportunity to rest. After all, the cavalry had covered in 3 days the distance that usually took a week. Suddenly, the approaching Uru reported that Rizel was being called by the great Saja. The old mage immediately jumped off his horse and followed the general. Passing through the forest thicket, Rizel was very surprised to find Chkunch Khan standing at the edge of the cliff. Without turning around, the great Saja asked if Rizal understands that the warriors of the Koguryo Empire and the local people are different. Of course, Rizal was aware of this, for despite his deep knowledge, no empire of Koguryo existed in the world known to him. The answer greatly surprised and disappointed Chuncheon. Rizal had also heard nothing about the states of Baekje, Silla, Paedal, or Huan, nor about the Tang dynasty. Where had they ended up then? Then Rizal reported that they were on the continent of Haiyan, and ventured to suggest that Chuncheon with the soldiers had crossed the interdimensional barrier and ended up in a completely different world. 10,000 years ago, the ancient dragon Besvard traveled the world and marked the coordinates of all the places he visited. There was a spell called teleportation that allowed movement through space between these coordinates. However, the mentioned Chuncheon states were not at any of the coordinates, so Rizal assumed that they came from another dimension. The great Saju was very interested in this ancient dragon, how he could prove that he had been everywhere, and why Rizal believed it so blindly. Then Rizal explained that dragons are an ancient great race, which no army in the world can approach. Smiling, Chuncheon pointed to the emblem on his chest. It depicted the raven Samjoko, a divine beast that fed on dragons. Passing by, the great Saja advised Rizal to no longer fear strange lizards, for he was the one who would crush them. Going out to his soldiers, who humbly awaited the return of their leader, Chuncheon finally realized that they would not return back. A scout squad led by Kaverion skillfully crossed the distance to the fortress gates. Helping each other up, the soldiers managed to climb the wall, and then quickly and quietly approached two guards, who did not even notice their appearance. The first guard died quickly. The blade passed through so that the unfortunate man could not even scream. Kaverion quickly covered the second guard's mouth, putting a finger to his lips to signal that the guard must not make a sound if he wanted to stay alive. The guard nodded affirmatively. Kaverion promised to leave the guard and even fulfill any of his wishes if he honestly answered how many guards were on the territory. As soon as Kaverion withdrew his hand, the guard immediately reported that there were 12 guards in total and another 5 in reserve in the building behind the wall. Satisfied with the answer, Kaverion inquired what the guard wanted. Embarrassed and hesitating, the guard asked for mercy, but after a moment's thought, he asked for some money and a horse to get away from here. Kaverion agreed without a shadow of doubt, and a joyful smile lit up the guard's face. He could hardly believe his luck. But the smile immediately disappeared when Kverion's blade pierced the guard's chest. A light signal was sent from the fortress wall to the horsemen hiding in the forest thicket. Seeing the signal, Chkuncheon ordered to move quietly and quickly. They planned to attack only Baron Elvin's estate. Touching ordinary people was forbidden. Kverion's reconnaissance squad quickly dealt with all the guards on the fortress wall and raised the grate. Therefore, the horsemen infiltrated the late Baron Elvin's estate without any problems. Chkuncheon praised Kverion and his squad and gave the order to move to the next gate. The soldiers immediately rushed to carry out the order. As soon as Kverion and his men disappeared from sight, Chkuncheon divided the horsemen into squads, which were to disperse and move toward the castle. If the squad suddenly encounters a patrol, eliminate on the spot without unnecessary talk. As soon as the squads reach their positions and hear the signal horn, the assault on the estate can begin. As soon as the orders were given, the horsemen moved towards the castle, trying not to make unnecessary noise. Meanwhile, Rizal, together with a small detachment by order of Chkuncheon, remained in the forest until the battle ended. His task was to determine what among all the loot had the greatest value, for Chuncheon had stormed the estate solely for profit. Moreover, Rizal needed to find books and maps that would help Chkuncheon and his people survive in these lands. Sitting by the campfire and thoughtfully gazing into the flames, Rizal came to the conclusion that Chuncheon had indeed decided to settle in these parts. Suddenly, a strange sound resembling the whistle of a released arrow was heard. At first, Rizal and the other soldiers thought it was the signal to start the assault. But suddenly, Rizal's eyes widened with horror when he finally realized what was the source of that sound. Without unnecessary explanation, he sharply dashed to the horses, simultaneously ordering the soldiers to immediately move out to the castle. Of course, the soldiers did not understand why there was such a rush all of a sudden, but they did not contradict or stop the mage. Untying the horse, Rizal scolded himself for his carelessness. He could not have imagined that there was a liaison mage in the castle. The soldier nearby tried to calm the old mage, assuring that they would deal with the mage before he delivered the message. But Rizal was clearly not satisfied with such a turn of events. Mounting his horse, he galloped with all his might towards the estate. Soldiers hurriedly began saddling their horses. Of course, Rizal understood perfectly well that it was necessary to stop the mage before the news reached the capital. Otherwise, no one would leave here alive. The phantom cavalry, led by Chuncheon, still managed to break through the main gates of the castle and burst into the adjacent territory. But a unit of spearmen immediately came out to meet the cavalry, and a fierce battle ensued. The defenders, caught off guard, defended themselves as best they could, but the numerical advantage was not on their side. The cavalry was ordered to kill everyone who offered any resistance. No one was to escape. Fierce battles raged throughout the territory adjacent to the castle, the ranks of spearmen melting before their eyes. As soon as the Goguryeo warriors managed to break through to the castle, Chuncheon ordered Uru to infiltrate inside and clear the estate. A small detachment led by Uru, having broken down the main doors, entered the estate. Uru promised that if anyone managed to leave the estate alive, he would personally tear off the head of the offender. The soldiers immediately dispersed, while Uru, accompanied by 2 knights, decided to first inspect the basement, as something interesting could usually be hidden there. Carefully descending the spiral staircase, Uru suddenly heard a strange sound, and with a gesture ordered the 2 soldiers to stop. Pressing his ear to the wall, he began to listen to the suspicious sound. It was clearly a human voice, so Uru, drawing his bowstring, signaled the soldiers to continue their descent, expecting an ambush at every step. Finally, having descended downstairs, Uru carefully peered around the corner and discovered a strange-looking man, most likely the local jailer. Without much thought, Uru fired a shot. Moans were heard, followed by a dull thud. Since the dungeon was quite dark, Uru ordered to find a torch. When the light illuminated the dungeon, Uru and the soldiers found the jailer dead, an arrow piercing him through, pinning the poor man to the wall. Carefully examining the cell, to his surprise, Uru and the soldiers found a girl chained to the wall. The warriors were enchanted by the woman's beauty, her skin white as jade and her ears were pointed. Of course, the Goguryeo warriors did not know that the chained girl was an elf, so, deciding that a fairy stood before them, all 3 immediately fell to their knees. Opening her eyes, the elf was very surprised. A tall dwarf with a bow instead of an axe, and 2 humans. The proud lands bowed their heads before her. Could she be asleep? Meanwhile, the battle on the estate grounds was over. Most of the guards were killed. Some surrendered. Huigaram approached Chuncheon and reported that they had killed everyone who even remotely resembled Baron Elvin's kin, and as proof showed a severed head. The great Saja was satisfied and ordered the bodies to be gathered. Suddenly, accompanied by soldiers, Rizal burst onto the estate grounds. Chuncheon was extremely surprised by the appearance of the old mage, as he clearly had not given a signal. So what made Rizal leave his hiding place? Out of breath, Rizal reported that there was a communication mage on the estate grounds who needed to be eliminated immediately. Rizal was about to suggest questioning the family or the servants of Baron Elvin about the whereabouts of the mage, but noticing the severed head in Huigaram's hands, he was horrified. Then Uru appeared from the estate accompanied by 2 soldiers carrying a girl on his back. Running up to Chuncheon, he reported that they had managed to save the fairy. Of course, Chuncheon was already informed about the elves, but how did Uru manage to find the elf in Baron Elvin's estate? Rizal was about to explain to Uru that the figure behind him was not a human and certainly not a fairy. But Chuncheon stopped him, noticing some movement on one of the towers. Rizal's eyes widened in horror. It was a communication mage who had already begun gathering energy. The communication spell acted like a magical beacon. The capital would instantly learn of their appearance, and judging by the mana, the mage could no longer be stopped. Chuncheon smiled at Uru, and he understood everything without unnecessary words. Carefully lowering the bewildered elf to the ground, Uru took careful aim. But Rizal objected that it was impossible to hit from such a distance. Even an elf could not manage that, so the only option was to run. Nevertheless, Uru ignored the old mage's remark and after taking careful aim, fired. To everyone's surprise, the mana disappeared after a second, and the communication mage fell like a stone. The soldiers, urged on by Uru, actively carried the loot into the inner courtyard. Deciding to personally sort the loot, Uru, accompanied by 2 warriors, proceeded to the estate, where he encountered a soldier carrying a box with strange contents. Uru immediately asked the soldier if it would be possible to sell such strange things, but the soldier had no definite answer. Suddenly, a piercing scream was heard from the neighboring room, and Uru and the soldiers rushed there at once. Opening the door, they found Rizal lamenting over a broken vial of mandrake extract. Of course, Uru did not know how valuable this extract was, so he tried to calm the old mage. But the angry Rizal first ordered everyone to leave, and then pushed Uru and the soldiers out the door himself. As soon as the door slammed shut, Rizal, falling onto the carpet, continued to mourn his so precious loss. Then Uru decided to check how things were going in the central hall. The soldiers were diligently moving the loot. One of them, seeing Uru, immediately reported that they had taken out all the most valuable items. Looking around carefully, Uru noticed good quality plate armor that his subordinates had forgotten about. Pointing to the armor, Uru ordered them to collect it immediately. The soldiers did not quite understand why they needed extra weight in the wagons. Poking a soldier in the chest, Uru replied that they would melt down the armor into arrows or something truly necessary, since there was not enough iron in the camp. In the central hall, Chuncheon thoughtfully examined all the loot that his subordinates had managed to find on the estate grounds. To transport everything, they clearly did not have enough carts, so Chuncheon ordered Huigoram to take 40 soldiers and distribute the surplus grain to the townspeople, prioritizing those who looked poorer. So he ordered to break or crush those very plate armors before loading. The soldiers immediately began to carry out the order, while the prisoners watched in horror as an entire estate, which could have supported several years of living, was destroyed. Finally finishing work, the soldiers smiled quite a bit. Unexpectedly, a noise was heard near one of the walls surrounding the estate. Suddenly a hand appeared from under the ground, and then from the pit that had formed climbed out a suspicious-looking man in a hood. Shaking off the dirt, the man smirked quite a bit. He had finally managed to sneak onto the estate grounds. Removing his hood, the man only now noticed that several dozen astonished people clad in impressive armor were looking at him. Drawing his sword, the man named himself Gerard Grumov and smiling called the warriors of Koguryo to attack. But to his surprise, not a single soldier moved from his place. Only when Chuncheon gave the order to seize Gerard did the soldiers move. Gerard was disappointed by such an attitude towards him. The best mercenaries bowed their heads as soon as they heard his name. He, the most majestic treasure hunter on the continent, one of the top 10 swordsmen, Gerard Thunderous, is greeted like this. But Gerard had barely finished his bravado when about a dozen arrows flying past him pierced the wall. One of them even scratched his cheek. Understanding that the numerical superiority was clearly not in his favor, and the opponents were serious, Gerard, throwing down his sword, decided to surrender. The soldiers, fearing that Gerard might do something foolish, tied him up with weapons pointed at him. And although Gerard had traveled across the entire continent, he saw people with black hair and eyes the color of a raven's wing for the first time. His thoughts were interrupted by hammer blows. The soldiers were destroying another batch of plate armor. Despite being a prisoner now, Gerard tried to stop the soldiers from such barbarism, as the armor was worth a lot of money. Then Chuncheon decided to ask him if the armor was really that valuable. Gerard replied that one such set could support an ordinary family for 10 years. Fine engraving and decoration, such armor was not comparable to ordinary plate mail. Such armor was not shameful for a ruler of some state to wear. But the Goguryeo warriors, ignoring his remark, continued methodically destroying the armor. Then Gerard shouted again for the soldiers to stop. Finally, Chuncheon gave the order to stop, hoping that at least something might have survived. But his hopes were dashed by Uru, who, smiling kindly, reported that he had personally dealt with the armor that the soldiers had not yet broken. Gerard was devastated. His carefree life was crying out. He was a treasure hunter who usually earned by clearing dungeons. But while the war was ongoing, he tried not to stand out and got by with small jobs. Hearing that Baron Elvin led the troops to the Laganza Mountains, Gerard came here to make some money. For him, the greatest hunter on the continent, robbing an empty house was a piece of cake. But everything went wrong. Although for a swordmaster like Gerard, escaping was easy. However, he surrendered on purpose. The reason was Gerard's professional illness, insatiable curiosity. He needed to learn everything about these strange people. An unexpected blow to the face snapped Gerard out of his thoughts. Of course, he immediately resented why Chuncheon did it. But he, passing by, only said that Gerard should no longer dare to speak to him arrogantly, and henceforth report important matters immediately. Not understanding why he should report to Chuncheon, since he was not his subject, Gerard decided to endure until he satisfied his curiosity. Rizel, examining the crushed armor, concluded that Chuncheon acted wisely, since now they needed materials and iron more than money. Moreover, Rizel believed that in wartime money was trash, so it was better to melt everything down, especially since they could get much more for dwarf-made armor. Dawn was approaching and Chuncheon gave the order to return. The wagons loaded with loot, accompanied by riders, left Baron Elvin's estate. In the morning, the townspeople, to their surprise, found bread and grain at their doors. The news of the defeat of Baron Elvin's estate quickly spread around. Of course, the residents did not know who could have done it and were very worried about possible consequences. Nevertheless, now they had enough grain to survive the winter. Wagons under the guard of the Phantom Cavalry slowly crossed the forest. Suddenly, one of the wagons, hitting a stone, broke a wheel and the procession was forced to stop. After inspecting the wheel, one of the soldiers rushed to the head of the caravan to report to Chuncheon about what had happened. Gerard, taking advantage of the stop, decided to think about what to do next. They were heading towards the infamous Laganza Mountains. The Goguryeo cavalry was clad in chainmail from head to toe. Even the horses were armored. It was also strange that their mana felt completely alien. Even Gerard, a master swordsman, could not accurately assess their strength. Of course, he understood that one mistake and escape would become impossible. But worrying about trifles was not his style. Despite the threats of the guards, Gerard rose from his knees, performed a somersault, broke the wooden bars of the cage, and was free. An alarm was instantly raised, and as soon as Gerard's feet touched the ground, several warriors already aimed their bows at him. Nevertheless, he was not inclined to give up so easily. Skillfully dodging the shots, he rushed to the nearest wagon loaded with loot. It was in this wagon that his travel bag was located. Quickly rummaging through it, Gerard took out a communication bracelet and uttering the activation phrase, he finally understood what the Goguryeo soldiers were saying. Hwigaram, who had managed to run to the noise, immediately ordered the other prisoners to calm down, dismount, and seize Gerard. Hwigaram's goal was to prevent Gerard from seizing a weapon. But to his surprise, Gerard again plunged his hand into the bag and pulled out his sword. The warriors were confused. How could such a huge sword fit into a small bag? Jumping off the cart, Gerard took a fighting stance, deciding it was time to run. Rushing forward, Gerard attacked Hwigaram, hoping that the heavy armor would slow him down. But to his surprise, Hwigaram easily parried the strike and Gerard had to retreat. Then, changing strategy, Gerard decided to test what the ordinary soldiers were capable of. After all, a commander remains a commander, and counting on an easy victory on his part was reckless. He attacked again, but this time at the last moment Gerard changed the blade's trajectory and attacked the soldier to the left of Hwigaram. What a shock Gerard experienced when the ordinary soldier blocked his strike just as easily, then delivered a sweeping blow which he barely dodged. Cursing, Gerard looked around. All without exception were clad in armor. It turned out escaping would be harder than he had thought, but surrendering was not in his rules. Raising his sword, Gerard launched an attack again against 3 opponents at once. Chunchin, who was watching the duel closely, noted that Gerard might be useful in the future. Uru, who was nearby and also observing the battle, agreed with him. Gerard's technique was indeed balanced, but it was not about technique at all, but about courage. Surely Gerard already understood that escaping would not be easy, yet his blade did not waver. The duel risked dragging on for a long time, as the warriors of Goguryeo could not fight at full strength without horses. Understanding this, Uru suggested sending a worthy swordsman to Gerard. He chose Kaverion as the candidate. Suddenly, Rizel approached them. He wanted to know what had happened in the rear and why there was a delay. Then Chuncheon explained to him that Gerard had managed to get out of the cage. The warriors had cornered him, but he was desperately trying to break through. Seizing the moment, Gerard managed to deflect the strike of all 3 soldiers and tried to attack Hwigaram. At the last moment, he still managed to block the lunge and attempted a counterattack. But Gerard, grouping himself, avoided the blow, then did a backflip and retreated. Soldiers immediately rushed to him, intending to finish the duel. Of course, Gerard understood that his opponents were experienced fighters. It was felt in every one of their movements. The longer he dawdled with them, the more problems he would have. Then roaring, Gerard used mana, charged his sword with lightning and struck. Hwigaram and the 3 soldiers managed to block the strike, but the lightning charge was so strong that it threw them back. Gerard was amazed because the warriors managed to block his sword without even charging the weapon with mana. Nevertheless, he was no longer going to conserve his strength. Finally realizing who was in front of him, Rizel even opened his mouth in surprise. After all, it was Gerard Thunder, ranked among the top 10 swordsmen on the continent, and the only swordmaster among the Free Knights. The soldiers tried to stop Gerard, but he scattered them like kittens, managed to knock one to the ground, and was already raising his sword to deliver a deadly blow. But an unexpected strike from the side, which Gerard still managed to block, pushed him back. He did not understand what was happening. How could someone stop his 2-handed sword? Before him appeared Kveron, introducing himself and wishing to fight Gerard one-on-one. Then Gerard summoned lightning again, but Kveron did not even raise an eyebrow, although the soldiers behind immediately grabbed their swords. Gerard was furious. Could the opponent not take him seriously? Anger gave him strength. The lightning covering his sword grew brighter, and the ground beneath his feet sank. Kveron was pleased. So this is the true aura of the sword. But Gerard did not understand what aura was being referred to. Nevertheless, Gerard was not going to dwell on this for long and immediately rushed into attack. Shifting his weight onto his left leg, Kveron prepared to attack. And when Gerard was already ready to strike, Kveron swung and made a counter-thrust. Miraculously, Gerard managed to fold and avoid the blow. Retreating, he tried to strike from behind, but Kveron managed to parry the thrust. Despite all the power Gerard possessed, the blow was so strong that it threw him backward. Kveron, however, did not move from his place. Smiling, he turned around. It seemed he was about to leave. Of course, Gerard immediately protested. What did this all mean? How dare the opponent ignore him when they had just begun the duel? But Kveron did not even think of retreating. Catching the sword and taking a combat stance, he began to concentrate. Gerard immediately felt changes in the air currents. Could it be that the enemy was going to use mana? Immediately raising his sword and summoning lightning again, Gerard prepared to attack. Suddenly, the air around him seemed to freeze. A second later, he was hit by a gust of wind. His sword broke in half, and a crash was heard behind him. Looking back, Gerard laughed hysterically. For several meters, the trees behind him had been cut down. Nevertheless, Gerard still expressed his respect for the opponent's skill. Kveron responded with mutual courtesy. Turning around, Gerard passed by Hwigaram and the soldiers, cursing that this stunt had cost him too much. Passing by the cart with crushed armor, Gerard threw the remains of the sword there and returned back to the cage. Comfortably settled on the floor, he gave orders to move forward like a commander. But Chun-Chun was extremely displeased with the prisoner's behavior and ordered him to come out immediately. For the rest of the way, Gerard, cursing himself for his carelessness, ran behind tied to the cart. Under the cover of night, 3 soldiers carefully sneaked to the edge of the forest and began digging the ground with knives. One of them exclaimed joyfully and carefully pulled a small clay pot covered with cloth from the ground. Suddenly, a small shadow blocked the moonlight for the soldiers. Crying out in fear, the soldiers, without raising their heads, began to apologize. The soldiers already thought that the ugly business had been caught personally by Buru, which meant punishment was inevitable, but they were just taking leftover grain to make some alcohol. But righteous punishment did not follow. Then one of the soldiers took a risk and slowly raised his gaze. Instead of Buru, one of the stone brothers with a red beard named Galing looked at him in surprise. Taking a sip from this cup, Galing wiped his beard with his sleeve contentedly. The drink the soldiers offered him turned out to be not so bad. It resembled more of a stew, but it was quite easy to drink. The soldiers explained that they mistook Galing for Buru, which is why they were so frightened. Galing laughed good-naturedly. The soldiers were sneaking around so suspiciously that he and his comrades took them for enemies and decided to follow them. The soldiers still wanted to know if the local drink pleased Galing and his comrades. Of course, the drink was not bad, but after exchanging glances, the dwarves said in unison that they preferred beer more. The soldiers opened their mouths in surprise. They did not know what beer was, so they asked Galing to explain. The dwarves tried to explain as best they could, but the soldiers did not gain any clarity about the unknown drink. Then one of them sighed sadly and expressed a desire to try the strange drink someday. Galing immediately suggested to the soldiers to taste the beer. Since they were treated, they should also toast. Returning to the smithy and tasting the strange drink, the soldiers were impressed by its unparalleled taste. They had no doubt that the dwarves managed to brew such a delicacy, but they became curious about what exactly the beer was made from. Galing looked at the soldiers in surprise. The question seemed very simple to him, since everyone knows that beer is made from barley. Then it was the soldiers' turn to be surprised. Where did the dwarf get the barley? To which Galing, without hesitation, blurted out that they borrowed the barley from the warehouse. Before he could finish the sentence, Melvin and Trigon immediately shut his mouth. And then the soldiers realized why the porridge had stopped being served for several days. If the dwarves get caught, then they are all definitely doomed. This is not about collecting leftovers for cheap booze. This is serious. Nevertheless, Galings assured the soldiers that he had everything under control. It's no coincidence that dwarves have a saying, caught means a crook, and if not, then a master. But as it turned out, Galing lacked the skill, and with a crash, the entrance door to the smithy flew to pieces, and Buru, clearly displeased, stormed inside. He heard every word perfectly, and now wished to bring punishment down on the heads of the guilty. The next morning, a trio of dwarves actively plowed the field allocated for barley. Buru, having taken a place on one of the towers, actively urged the guilty on. When night fell, the ghostly cavalry settled for a rest. In the center of the camp stood a large tent, which belonged to the great Sajé. In the tent, Uru, Chun-Chun, and Rizel wanted to question the elf about how she ended up in such a deplorable condition. Rizel was the first to speak. Introducing himself, he greeted the child of the forest. The elf thanked them for the rescue and introduced herself in return. Her name was Hydia, and she belonged to the clan of the High Elves. Hearing this, Rizel even opened his mouth in surprise, because for ordinary elves, the High Elves were like supreme priests. So how did a High Elf end up captive to humans? Then Hydia told that their clan wandered between the settlements of their kin and blessed the newborns. During one of such journeys on the lands of Baron Elvin, she was captured. The Baron's soldiers had a rare artifact, shackles that blocked mana, so Hydia could not escape. Rizel was extremely surprised at how Baron Elvin planned to deal with the consequences of what he had done, since even ordinary elves knew that if you touch a high elf, you inevitably bring upon yourself terrible revenge. Suddenly, Uru, a little embarrassed, asked the old mage to lend him a communication ring, but Chun-Chun immediately protested. How he had the audacity to ask for such a valuable relic for personal needs. Uru immediately apologized, but then recalled that Chun-Chun himself had used the ring improperly. Suddenly, Hydia stood up from the chair and approached Uru. Touching his forehead with hers, she said, "Iluen hayon sharoyem dialadium." As soon as the words were spoken, the tent was illuminated by a bright light. Rizel and Chun-Chun watched the event attentively. When the light went out, Hydia bowed her head and greeted Uru, who to his surprise understood her perfectly. Then Chun-Chun decided to ask Rizel what was actually happening, how Uru was able to understand the elf's speech. In turn, Rizel tried to explain that the High Elves possess divine power that allows them to harmonize their speech with the language of the interlocutor. In a way, this could be called magic. Although Hydia said she belonged to the elf race, Uru still fell to his knees before her, continuing to consider her a fairy. Leaning down and looking into Uru's eyes, Hadia said she felt the mighty winds of the continent rushing over the land. Uru smiled joyfully. Could it be that Hadia was speaking about him now? She smiled in response and nodded affirmatively. Then Hadia looked at Rizel and asked him not to hurry, telling him that one day he would overcome obstacles on the path to enlightenment and achieve harmony with eternity. Bowing his head, Rizel thanked the elf for the guidance. Not fully understanding what was happening, Chunchon decided to ask what exactly Hadia was doing. To which Rizel replied that one of the features of the High Elves is the ability to see the essence of things. Kneeling down and looking into Haidia's eyes, Chunchon asked what she saw in his eyes. Haidia found it difficult to answer this question, for in Chunchon's eyes she saw only emptiness and nothing more. Hearing this, Uru burst into loud laughter. Could it be that Haidia wanted to say that their general's head was empty? But Uru did not laugh for long. Chunchon quickly reprimanded him, and then simply dragged the unconscious body out of the tent. The next day, the ghostly cavalry led by Chunchon had to cross a gorge. When they had already passed more than half the way, suddenly a command to stop was sounded. Ahead, their path was blocked by a whole horde of orcs. The leader of this pack of orcs was Bubakal, the son of the very Mukabil, who fell at the hands of the Goguryeo warriors. Uru immediately ordered the archers to fall back, and personally led the ghostly cavalry, which had advanced forward, to the left flank. Noticing this rearrangement, Bubakal immediately called the orcs to cluster together, but unlike Mukabil, who left passages for the enemy, Bubakal blocked all paths for the cavalry without exposing his warriors to fire, especially since this time there were only a dozen riders against them. Galloping at full speed, Uru did not understand at all what was happening and why the orcs had clustered together. Haidia, who was sitting behind Uru, noticed that a single cavalry unit could not break through such a dense formation of orcs. So why were the riders charging headlong instead of waiting for reinforcements? Having asked Haidia to hold the horse, Uru raised his bow and took aim. The riders behind him followed his example. Haidia was extremely amazed. Uru sat very confidently in the saddle despite having dropped the reins, for even elves did not achieve such unity with their mounts. Looking back, he asked Haidia to hold on tighter. She immediately pressed closer to him, and Uru himself smiled and fired. The shot was extremely accurate. The arrow hit the orc right between the eyes. Immediately after, the mounted riders fired volleys, each arrow hitting its target precisely. Haidia's astonishment knew no bounds. The arrows, released by the children of nature, were guided by the elements themselves, but in these arrows she did not feel even a trace of spirit power. Haidia also noticed that the technique of the Goguryeo warriors was different. Even at full gallop, their arrows flew faster than the elves. The orc formation collapsed. Monsters struck by arrows fell, trampling those who were still standing. Falling to the ground, Bubakal could not believe that humans were capable of shooting a bow at full gallop. Before Bubakal was forever buried under the bodies of his comrades, he saw his father's face one last time. Those who still managed to survive in this hell were immediately caught by the riders, leaving no chance for the orcs. But the most surprised by this battle tactic was Gerard, for he had never before seen heavy cavalry shoot bows while mounted. Even Imperial Knights were not capable of this. Finally, Gerard realized that all 150 Goguryeo warriors were knights, and each of them was at least equivalent to a son of the sword. Those who took the path of the sword began as squires, and then became skilled swordsmen. When they mastered the aura, they were called sword warriors, and then sons of the sword. The final level was the swordmaster. There were only 15 such people on the entire continent, including Gerard himself. That is why Gerard was so astonished, because even if you gathered all the sons of the sword on the continent, there would barely be 200 of them. Trailing behind the wagon, Gerard was lost in thought. The Laganza Mountains are one of the harshest places to live, so how could a whole state arise in such a wilderness? Not noticing that the wagon had stopped, Gerard, still immersed in his thoughts, painfully bumped into it. Rubbing the bruised spot, Gerard wanted to protest why they had stopped. But raising his gaze, Gerard opened his mouth in surprise. In the middle of the Laganza forest stood a fortress. A message about the arrival of the great Saji sounded, and the guards immediately opened the massive wooden gates. Entering the fortress grounds, Gerard was stunned. On both sides of the road for a long stretch stood soldiers fully clad in armor, as if they had come out to meet their leader. Buru bowed his head to greet Chunchon, who carefully inspected the surroundings and was pleased. Finally, this place began to look like a real village. Smiling quite a bit, Buru looked at the 3 dwarves behind him, whose appearance left much to be desired. Noticing the dwarves, Chunchon asked what had happened to them. But Buru assured that there was nothing to worry about. They just had to work a little on their upbringing. Finally, Buru noticed Gerard tied behind the cage and decided to inquire who this grimy ragamuffin was. Nodding at Gerard with a disapproving look, Chun-chan explained that he was a tomb raider who also wielded a sword quite well. Buru's eyes widened in surprise. Could it be that he heard words of praise from the mouth of the greatest Saji himself? Approaching closer, Buru decided to find out the name of the one Chun-chan praised so highly. Gerard introduced himself, but instead of a greeting, he received a blow right to the jaw. Not understanding what was happening at all, Gerard tried to retreat, but Buru skillfully tripped him and knocked him to the ground. Then he began mercilessly beating Gerard. The thing was that Buru did not hear the name clearly, and decided that the stranger called him a fatso, so he flared up. Rizal, who was watching what was happening, did not understand why Buru was so cruel, since Gerard had simply said his name. Chun-chan, who was also observing, ordered Gerard to be hanged. Of course, Rizal tried to object, since Sir Gerard was a master swordsman. But Chun-chan did not listen to him, and simply left. At sunset, wandering around the fortress grounds among the still unfinished buildings, Rizal was attracted by a shout and swearing. Passing by the source of the noise, Rizal discovered Gerard, who was dangling upside down. Nearby was Chun-chan. Despite Gerard's swearing and threats, the great Saja remained calm. Then he swung his sword. Rizal immediately shouted, trying to stop Chun-chan. He wanted to know why the great Saja was acting this way. Chun-chan stopped the sword a couple of centimeters from the prisoner's face, and then without turning around, replied that Gerard needed to be finished off now, so as not to regret it in the future. Then Rizal tried to object. After all, Gerard Thunder was known on the continent, and his murder would have consequences. But Chun-chan was not worried about the consequences, because he dragged Gerard into the fortress not to show off. As it turned out, Gerard refused to serve Chun-chan, and the loser in battle has little choice, serve the victor or die. Until now, Chun-chan had been dealing with Gerard only because he could enter the top 10 of his strongest warriors, but since Gerard refused, there was no need to be ceremonious anymore. Gerard immediately protested. He was one of the 15 swordmasters on the continent. It was foolish to think that among the warriors of Goguryeo there were 9 men stronger than him. In Chun-chan's opinion, he was still too inexperienced, though talented. If Gerard still joined him, he would fully reveal his potential. Gerard could not tolerate such treatment. After all, he was a swordmaster, and they treated him like an object, better death. Then Chun-chan, swinging his blade, with one movement cut the rope and Gerard, swearing, fell to the ground. Then Chun-chan raised the sword upwards, and it was enveloped by a column of colorless aura. Rizal even gasped in surprise. Chun-chan was able to summon an invisible aura blade without any mana attribute. The color of the aura blade always depends on the owner's attribute. For example, Gerard's is milky white, but Chun-chan's aura had no color at all. Just a shimmering transparent blade, almost 5 meters long. Gerard's 1 meter is nothing compared to that. Of course, Gerard was aware of the difference in strength, but he was still a knight. If Chun-chan does not respect him, then at least let him not insult knightly honor. Hiding the sword in its sheath, Chun-chan asked with contempt what exactly knightly honor is, which every knight shouts about in turn. Gerard was very surprised. Could it be that Chun-chan does not know what it is? A knight is loyal to his lord and must protect the weak. In response, Chun-chan only smiled maliciously. Is that all? A domestic dog is also loyal to its owner, and growls, protecting its puppies. By Gerard's logic, it turns out that a dog is also a knight. Gerard was about to object, but Chun-chan, not waiting for an answer, turned around and ordered him to follow. Now Gerard would personally see what a true knight is. Chun-chan, accompanied by Gerard and Rizal, approached the training ground where former plowmen were training with the warriors of Goguryeo. Pointing to the fighters on the ground, Chun-chan said that these are the knights. But Gerard did not understand what he meant, as it looked more like a bunch of riffraff, but certainly not knights. The fighters, noticing that the great Saja himself had come to watch them, immediately straightened up and lined up in ranks awaiting orders. Pointing to the fighter in the first row, Chun-chan asked why he was here, to which the former farmer answered without hesitation, to defeat his enemies and protect the country, because then he could save his family. Then Chun-chan asked why the fighter should fight, since he could die in battle, but if he surrendered, both he and his family would survive. But the fighter replied that this was simply impossible, because then they would lose their will. Gerard was very impressed by such an answer. His abilities were so-so, but the boy had spirit. Nevertheless, anyone like that is trained at any knight academy. Of course, Chun-chan agreed with him, but 3 months ago the people before them were simple farmers. If Gerard valued the empty title of knight so much, they would not keep it for him. But Chun-chan asked him to remember one thing. Everyone takes up the sword for one reason, and the title of knight does not make this reason special. The people before him took up the sword to defend the country they built. Whether to stay or leave could only be decided by Gerard, however. Chun-chan warned him that if he did leave the fortress, there would be no mercy at their next meeting. The next day, Gerard, walking around the district, kept thinking about yesterday's events. Suddenly, Gerard's attention was caught by children who, to his surprise, were practicing archery. As it turned out, the soldiers gave the children bows, but Gerard could not understand why exactly they did this. The answer turned out to be simply that the children wanted to protect their mother. And according to the soldiers' assurances, one must know how to fight to live freely, as they do now. Seriously looking at the boy, Gerard was about to scold him, but suddenly Rizel called out to him. The old mage wanted to talk, so he suggested taking a walk. Leisurely strolling around the surroundings, Gerard suddenly asked where the warriors of Koguryo originally came from. Rizel did not know the exact answer, but could only assume that they are people just like everyone else. Only their way of life differs. Then Gerard pondered. What about order? The nobility wields the pen and the sword to rule over the commoners. If the commoners master both, who will suppress the rebellion, and how will the nobility survive? Then Rizel explained that the Koguryo Empire highly values strength, yet their thoughts are clear. When Rizel asked Chunchan if he was not afraid of a rebellion by teaching commoners literacy and martial arts, Chuncheon only smiled in response, saying it is simply necessary to ensure that there is no rebellion. If people do not know why they take up the sword, then they will never see victory. If they do not know what they are protecting and what the victory is for, such a victory is worthless. Therefore, people must know and be wise so that the ruler does not make mistakes in the future. Gerard immediately protested. He could not understand what this even meant. But Rizel replied that these are merely the thoughts of the man he calls his lord. Rulers have duty and responsibility, and if they make fools of the people, it will lead to the ruin of the ruler and the country. After a few days, Chuncheon decided to inspect his possessions. Leisurely walking, he was immersed in thoughts about their future. Suddenly, Gerard appeared to meet him. After long deliberations, he still decided to accept Chuncheon's offer and stay. The great Saja was very pleased with such a decision. Nevertheless, Gerard wanted to know if it was true that Chuncheon would let him go if he decided to leave. Of course, Chuncheon would kill him in case of refusal. An ironic smile appeared on Gerard's face. Therefore, he decided to ask why then Chuncheon did not immediately tell him to choose between death and service. Why lie? The answer was quite simple. Chuncheon did not need cowards clinging to life. Now Gerard began to understand why Chuncheon demanded sincerity even from simple peasants. Nevertheless, he was curious to know how all this would end. Kneeling on one knee, Gerard Thunder, a free knight of the continent, swore loyalty to Chuncheon before the heavens. With respect, Chuncheon accepted his oath, asking to be killed if he strayed from the righteous path. Rising from his knees, Gerard departed. Unexpectedly, a vision of his near future appeared before him. He, clad in heavy armor, was at the head of a ghostly cavalry. Such a future pleased Gerard, and smiling, he continued on his way. Watching the departing knight, Chuncheon exhaled with relief. Now, for some time, there was no need to worry about money, because now he had a specialist in dungeons with him. Standing on the pier, Chuncheon, gazing into the night sky, recalled the words of Rizel and Huigaram. There was no way back, and Chuncheon had to make a choice he believed he was not ready for. The next day, to the surprise of Huigaram and Mudon, the great Saja appeared in the meeting hall in full battle armor. Chuncheon ordered them to immediately gather all generals of adjutant rank and above and not to forget to call Rizel and Gerard. Not understanding what was happening and why they were summoned so urgently to the meeting hall, Rizel and Gerard ran at full speed. It was not worth angering the lord. Bursting into the meeting hall, they found an unusual scene. Chuncheon sat at the head of the table, and on both sides, in full armor, stood the generals and senior military ranks of Goguryeo. Rizel and Gerard were impressed. Even at the Imperial Council, one would not see such precise discipline. The generals looked like privates before their lord. Casting a glance over those present, Chuncheon asked if everyone was in place, to which Huigaram nodded affirmatively. Without unnecessary words, the servant brought out and placed a small wooden casket before Chuncheon. As soon as the great Saja slightly opened the casket, everyone in the hall felt a colossal surge of power. The generals immediately stood at attention. Gerard also felt the tension but, like Rizel, had no idea what was going on at all. Carefully taking the banner from the chest, which was the source of unimaginable power, Chuncheon descended and handed it to Huigaram. And while Huigaram was assembling the flagpole, Chuncheon addressed his people. Now they had nowhere to return to, and retreat was not an option. That is why Chuncheon made the difficult decision that here they would continue the history of Goguryeo. As soon as Huigaram hoisted the banner on the flagpole, the warriors immediately dropped to one knee as a sign of their loyalty to the empire. With their mouths open, Rizel and Gerard watched what was happening, wondering what this banner could mean. Carefully taking the flag from Huigaram's hands, Chuncheon headed for the exit. Without any words, the knights rose from their knees and followed their leader. Hydia, who was spending time in the forest thicket with its inhabitants, also felt a surge of energy. In strength, it resembled a dragon's aura, although Hydia was certain it was not hers. In the smithy, the old man Chan even stopped working when he saw the flow of energy coming from the meeting hall. He immediately jumped up and ran to the adjacent room. The dwarves were extremely puzzled as to why the work suddenly stopped, because if the metal cooled, it would have to be reheated. Galing was about to check what was happening, but suddenly Old Man Chan came out to them fully clad in armor, with a wooden case on his back. Then the dwarves asked again why he stopped the work, but Chan, without answering them, headed to the source of the energy. The dwarves exchanged glances and followed him. Chunchin, with a banner in his hands, accompanied by the highest military command, entered the village. Seeing him, the men dressed in light armor armed themselves, left their homes, and joined the procession. Climbing onto the wooden platform, Chunchin struck the flagpole on the ground, and the soldiers immediately lined up, kneeling, awaiting the words of their lord. Then the great Saja spoke. He is the son of a concubine and a proud descendant of Yolja, promising to bring good to humanity. To those who disobey and go into betrayal, he will be merciless and will unleash upon them the iron hammer of justice. Under the banner of the three-legged crow, Chunchon, ascending the throne of Yolja, swore to the heavens to crush enemies with the iron hammer and be a shield for his people until the end of his life. An old man named Chang climbed onto the wooden platform. Kneeling on one knee, he handed Chunchon an open case. From the case, Chunchon took out the symbol of power in the Goguryeo Empire, an elegantly forged sword, which immediately became covered with a priceless aura. Raising the sword upward, Chunchon declared that the Goguryeo Empire will not be a country ruled by Yolja, but a country that Yolja protects. Generals, ordinary soldiers, and even the villagers burst into joyful exclamations. Hydia, who was watching everything from the side, stepped forward and knelt, which greatly surprised the nearby dwarves, because high elves do not bow their heads to anyone, not even to dragons. Kneeling down, Hydia